On this day, the weather outside was pleasantly warm. The residents of the small town gradually filled the streets, greeting each other and inquiring about their well-being. Children frolicked outside under the careful supervision of their parents. Suddenly, an unknown man in a dark cloak appeared not far from the little girl who was happily running to her mother. The child looked back and examined the stranger with surprise. The girl asked her mother with interest if it was the one she was thinking of. The woman replied with a dismissive cluck. Looking at the short man dressed in dark robes, she ordered her daughter not to look at him. The people around him regarded the familiar man with equal disdain. They watched in disgust as the corpse collector moved away toward the shopping plaza. After a while, the guy ended up near one of the commercial buildings near the center. From the name of the signboard, we could tell that the local merchant was a miser of various junk. The old man sitting behind the counter looked toward the entrance with irritation as the door opened. When he saw the guy in the cloak, he asked why the corpse collector had come to see him this time. The other visitors also looked at the man with rejection. As the boy approached the counter, the other customers hurried toward the exit. The guy pulled a sack out of his sinus and unfolded it and dumped some bones, claws, and feathers on the tabletop. Immediately, he said that he wanted to sell it all. The miser examined the unexpected merchandise and thought that this kid had brought him some trash again. A second later, he pulled a few bronze coins out of his pocket and tossed them on the table, said he wouldn't give any more for this junk, and ordered the boy to get away. The guy looked at those pennies in surprise and realized that this time he had only been given 20% of the usual price. Furious, he asked the salesman why he was paid so little this time. Suddenly, the old man called the boy a miserable bastard and said that he didn't have a single right to say anything against him since he was just a miserable corpse collector. In this world, there is a danger that awaits anyone at every turn. These are monsters that people have had to live with for decades. However, there are also those who hunt these monsters. Those who decide to dedicate their lives to this and test their fate are called adventurers. Such people mine a lot of expensive materials every day and fight monsters every day. By defeating monsters, they increase their level. Even a slight difference in this metric makes a huge difference in strength. After all, level is the foundation of this world. The hero looked at his hands and almost cried. For him, the bitter realization was that in such a cruel world, his level was 1. This guy's name is Ark, and despite his despicable status, he is also an adventurer. After being chased out of the store, the boy went to the market square. As he approached the familiar shop, the boy greeted the old man in the apron and asked if he had some bread for him. The vendor recognized Ark, and pulling a bag from under the counter, said he'd left some bread he hadn't been able to sell yesterday. The boy was a little upset, but still handed over his hard-earned money, realizing that he shouldn't complain. Suddenly, the old man turned to the boy and asked if he should leave his job as an adventurer. This unexpected question put Ark in a stupor. The salesman went on to say that not all people succeed in finding their calling the first time around, and perhaps the boy could find something more suited to him. Ark barely squeezed out a smile and said that he couldn't leave his business after all. He was a notorious corpse collector and no one would just want to hire him. Ever since he was a child, Ark wanted to be an adventurer. But when his dream came true, he learned of his curse. To his great regret, he was among the small number of people who possessed the ability of 0 experience. Unlike most adventurers who possessed many useful skills, the lad had rather received a special curse. No matter how many times Ark tried to fight monsters, his level still didn't increase. Even trying to defeat the weakest slimes, he wasn't getting any use out of them. And yet, for several years, the hero tried not to give up. Time after time, he entered the dungeon, hoping that sooner or later he would be able to level up. But each such foray ended in failure. Ark remained on the first level. In the end, he finally lost all hope. But still the boy wished to become an adventurer, and then he found an unconventional way out of this situation. Ark began collecting materials from the corpses of monsters that had previously been defeated by the adventurers. That's when the whole town became aware of him as a notorious corpse collector. Trying to chew the slightly stale bread, Ark thought that the materials from the first-level monsters were worth too little, and he should look for better monsters. The boy realized that by collecting every little thing, he would not be able to live for long. Suddenly, several people walked past the protagonist, one of whom accidentally poked the guy in the shoulder. Ark dropped the bread and immediately fell to the ground. The adventurer, who had confronted him a second earlier, saw the familiar cloak. A moment later, he walked over to the bread Ark had dropped and stepped on it with his foot. The boy looked up and said that it was his last meal. However, the man named Jarg looked down on him with contempt. The adventurer immediately recognized the corpse collector. His partners were very pleased with the leader's action. Ark once again looked at his assailant with an uncomprehending stare. Everyone in the city knew him as a corpse collector. Because of this stupid nickname, the boy can't find any other job. The hero looked at the trampled loaf and wondered again why this was happening to him. Ark thought frustratedly that his only desire was to follow his dream. But still, no matter how much he was despised, he couldn't just stop searching corpses. Realizing that otherwise he would simply starve to death, the protagonist looked into the goblin cave, populated mostly by low-level monsters. As he looked around the endless ramifications, Ark hoped that at least this time he would find something worthwhile. Suddenly, there was a horrible stench in the tunnel directly in front of him. The hero thought that most likely something very badly rotted here. When he looked ahead, he couldn't believe his eyes. In front of the boy lay a large dragon carcass. Its whole body was covered with wounds, and it was beginning to rot. Examining the huge corpse, Ark realized that most likely this monster was around level 200. Then the boy thought that now was not the best time to think about it, and he should finish examining the corpse as soon as possible, because most likely he would be able to get some good materials from it, from which he could make money. The corpse collector looked deep into the dragon's innards and realized that no one had left him any dear parts. His attention was drawn to an organ that looked very much like a stomach. Ark realized that it wasn't usually touched, as it had a very strong stench inside. But he was not afraid of it, for corpses were his main livelihood. Suddenly, the boy felt something inside his stomach. He was glad that there seemed to be something inside the organ. Ark immediately prepared a knife to open the stomach. Overcoming all dislike, he thrust the knife in close. After the incision was made, the protagonist could not believe his eyes. Inside the state organ, there was a gleam, and the boy saw an object that looked like armor. Finally cutting his stomach open, Ark realized that he had stumbled upon some armor. Suddenly, several bright lightning bolts burst from the metal breastplate. The boy was startled, and he jerked backward. Ark figured that if the case involved something dangerous, he wouldn't be able to resist it. Suddenly, a voice from the cut stomach urged the boy to put on his armor. The boy was very surprised that some armor was talking to him. The terrified hero realized that these were definitely very dangerous items anyway. Ark decided not to tempt fate and turned around and headed towards the exit of the cave. But at the same moment, he noticed that someone was blocking his path. There were several goblins standing right in front of the boy, waving their hands threateningly in his direction. Ark realized that even such a seemingly uncomplicated obstacle would be a challenge for him. The guy couldn't understand how he couldn't sense the approach of so many opponents. As he drew his sword and prepared to fight, he realized that now he would have to pay for his inattention. Ark looked fearfully at the approaching goblins and realized that although they were of the same level, his equipment level was too low. Suddenly, 3 monsters pounced on the protagonist at once. Already after the goblin's first blow, the boy could not keep his sword in his hands, and it flew off to the side. He looked fearfully at the monsters again and couldn't believe it would end like this. It was probably the most shameful of all possible outcomes. But now it was a foregone conclusion. Ark couldn't believe that he would take his life in a place like this, having accomplished nothing in so many years. But at the same instant, the armor suddenly called out to the boy once again. It urged the protagonist to put it on. Ark realized that he wasn't a lifer anyway, and it looked like he was going to have to take his chances. With another glance at the goblins, the boy shouted to the armor that he was agreeing to wear it. At the same instant, the monsters once again attacked the boy. Looking at the attacking monsters, Ark realized that it was better to trust fate completely than to die so easily. Suddenly, the armor responded that the new host's intentions were confirmed, and the new owner's registration was complete. The armor shuddered, and a voice said, activating the fast vestment. Ark turned around and saw several black lightning bolts flying towards him. A moment later, there was a small flash around the protagonist, raising dust in the cave. The goblin stopped and looked at the enemy with some surprise. The system announced that the donning of the abyss armor was complete. At the same moment, Ark stood before his enemies in his new armor. Peering at the clawed gauntlets, the lad wondered if this strange armor was on his side. Armor replied that she was on the hero's side, at which point Ark said he would check that out now. In the same instant, several goblins swooped down on the guy at once. In addition to the armor, Ark also received a sword that was clearly better than his last blade. The boy swung his weapon and with one blow calmly cut down one of the advancing goblins. In the same instant, the monster's entire body was covered in an unknown glow. As the goblin's body fell to the ground, a blob of energy began to flow from its torso towards the protagonist. A second later, a beam of light pierced the body of Ark, who didn't realize what was happening. But there was no time to think, for two more goblins were advancing from the right. Turning around, the hero handled them with equal ease. A smile appeared on his face for the first time in a long time. The carcasses of these monsters also began to emit an unknown glow. Ark only had time to think that his body was very light, but immediately two blobs of energy flew back into his body. As he looked at the remaining opponents, the guy thought he was getting the feeling that he was getting stronger and stronger with each blow. The remaining goblins were slaughtered with the same speed as the last. After defeating the last of his opponents, the guy stopped, trying to figure out how he felt. The first surprise for Ark was that he survived. For the first time, he was able to fight back against the monsters. But the big surprise was that the boy managed to defeat 5 goblins at once, being at the first level. An unknown glow also poured out from the bodies of the last monsters. But suddenly, the system notified that the adventurer's level had been raised several times at once. Ark couldn't believe his eyes. He had just been told that the guy had raised his current level to 6th. The boy stood still, unable to move from shock. Announcements of this nature were new to him, and he didn't understand what it meant. Plus, it was very strange, considering he had a curse from an early age that prevented him from gaining experience to level up. Suddenly, a system screen popped up in front of the protagonist, notifying him that thanks to the Abyss armor, Ark had the ability to use the level absorption skill. The boy had never heard of anything like this before. It was then that he saw that he had indeed reached the 6th level. However, it was not done by gaining additional experience. Looking at his arm, Ark realized that this armor allowed him to steal levels from monsters and other creatures. In the same instant, he cried with happiness, not believing what was happening. The boy stood alone in the empty cave, trying to contain his emotions. In that second, Ark realized that he was now starting a new life. After calming down a bit, the boy raised the sword in his hand and realized that he had held the blade before without much difficulty. However, now he had the feeling that all actions were easier and faster. In just a few minutes, the protagonist was able to get 5 levels at once. Now Ark could quietly go about his pumping without any difficulty. After happily running back and forth across the cave, he stopped to catch his breath. His gaze fell once again on the dragon lying on the ground. Now that he had taken it to the next level, the smell of that corpse felt even more unpleasant. But still, the protagonist had to pay tribute to this dragon, because thanks to him, he was able to move to another stage of development. The boy looked around and examined the goblin corpses lying to the side. Suddenly, a startling thought struck him. At that moment, Ark thought that if he defeated the remaining creatures in this cave, he could become many times stronger in a short period of time. Examining his body once again, the guy realized that most likely, thanks to this armor, he would not be able to be wounded. That was why there was now the perfect moment to kill all the goblins using such an opportunity. But no sooner had the boy thought about it than suddenly a loud stomping sounded behind him. Ark saw something huge appear behind his back, casting a shadow over him. The protagonist tried to figure out what kind of feelings he had just experienced. Looking around, he thought, there certainly shouldn't be any strong goblins in this cave. But when Ark saw what appeared behind his back, he was stunned and unable to say a word. The Goblin Lord towered in front of him. The system said that his level was 35. A crowd of several dozen smaller goblins had also gathered right behind him. The boy tried to assume a fighting pose, not realizing where one of the higher monsters had come from. After assessing the situation, he realized that he would definitely not win this fight and needed to rush to the exit. However, behind his back, several small monsters were already climbing onto the dragon carcass, thus blocking the exit. The terrified hero realized that these creatures were attracted to the smell of rotting meat. Suddenly, the armor warned the wearer that the main opponent was level 35 and recommended that the guy retreat. No sooner had Ark thought that escape wouldn't be so easy than the Supreme Goblin struck the first blow at the same instant. The boy had managed to deflect, but he was now in a vulnerable position. The monster that realized this immediately re-attacked the protagonist, who managed to block the blow at the last moment. Yet the force of the goblin's swing was so startling that Ark was thrown several meters aside. The protagonist flew into one of the cave walls with all his might and fell, unable to move. After gathering his wits, the boy barely lifted himself up. He looked straight in front of him and saw a high goblin walking towards him. Ark was surprised at the monster's monstrous strength. After looking into the eyes of this horrible creature, the protagonist realized that he was still too weak. Being cornered, Ark lost his composure for a moment and shouted with all his might. Barely holding back tears, the boy couldn't believe that only a short time ago, he had just succeeded in reaching a new level. And now, he was once again in a hopeless situation. And yet, after a few more dodges, the guy still managed to sneak out into one of the narrow passageways. However, there was now the question of how the protagonist would get out of this trap. The main exit is guarded by an army of goblins that he certainly couldn't handle. Looking around, Ark tried to think of some other method to get out of the cave. Noting his weakness once again, he thought that one logical way out might be to simply wait for the goblin army to move away from the exit. Suddenly, a knife-wielding monster appeared right in front of the boy in the hallway. This level 1 goblin was all alone and posed no danger at all. After the creature jumped, trying to attack Ark, the guy grabbed the monster's head. In the next instant, he spun around and smashed the goblin's head against the cave wall. After making sure the enemy was dead, the guy let go of the breathless body. Absorbing the creature's level, the protagonist stated that in this world, level decides everything. Then he also thought that any monster should understand the difference between the two, just as Ark himself understood his difference between him and the Goblin Lord. While the boy was thinking about it, the system alerted him to a level up. A blob of energy flowed into the hero's body, and suddenly Ark came to another thought. After all, at that moment, there was nothing stopping him from gaining a level in the dungeon to defeat the Goblin Lord later on. Whereas before he couldn't kill, now everything has changed. In his new reality, he has to kill to survive. A few minutes later, the hallways of the cave erupted in a frenzy of screams. Ark found one goblin after another and immediately cut them down. With each new victim, the level gradually increased. The progression was very fast. After a short period of time, any goblin ceased to present any difficulty and became merely a chore. Ark would knock out monsters in groups. After that, he waited for the level to be absorbed. Then he thought with indifference that in this world only the strongest survives. Those who want to survive must have a high level, and anyone who shows weakness will always obey the strong. Ark knew that from his own experience. After how many minutes of carnage, the guy continued to make his way deeper into the caves. By then, he had already reached level 15. Suddenly, Ark saw a passageway in front of him, which was illuminated by 2 torches. The mysterious branch in the corridor interested the hero. Plus, the armor suddenly said that on his recommendation, the lad should check out the side caves. The protagonist, interested on, went towards the passageway, hoping there was something of value there. When he had passed through the passage, Ark could not believe his eyes. He saw a small room filled to the top with gold coins and various riches. Inspecting the untold riches, the boy realized that the goblins had stolen all these treasures from the humans. This was not surprising, as ordinary humans cannot cope with even the weakest of creatures. Looking around the space around him, the hero decided to look for something he could use, and that he could use. Suddenly, his gaze fell on a strange box to his right. Ark walked over to the interesting object and pulled the cover off of it. The box was filled to the top with various elixirs. Armor explained that it was presumably a recovery potion. The boy took one of the flasks in his hand, and after examining the liquid inside, he realized that it looked like it was. Deciding it was a useful item, he took a few with him for the battle. It was then that Ark learned through the system that there was a special space in the armor specifically for potions. Suddenly, the left side of the armor glowed brightly, startling the wearer. After the flash ended, the guy noticed that he now had a special notch for potions. Satisfied, Ark immediately slipped the first flask into the vacant cell. Thus, he emptied the entire container, mentally thanking the armor. After examining the untold riches lying around, the boy thought it would be nice to take a few bags of coins from here, but they would get in the way in battle. Despite his rapid pumping, Ark's main goal now was to return to the city alive and unharmed. Now that the hero is stronger, he will be able to return and take on the business of selling materials from higher-ranked monsters. But in order to do so, he had to pass a very difficult test. After pondering a plan of action, Ark decided to set off when suddenly someone's voice came from behind him. The boy was very much surprised by this, for the voice was clearly human. Turning around, Ark ran towards the boxes from behind which someone was calling for help. Running around the clutter, the guy looked around the place where someone had yelled from. Suddenly, the boy saw that a frightened girl with bound hands and feet was sitting across from him. Then he realized that the goblins seemed to be kidnapping people as well. At the sight of her savior, the girl cried with happiness. Ark decided not to delay and immediately untied the captive. As he untangled the rope, he looked at the girl with a sympathetic look and said she was very lucky he had noticed her. A captive named Mill, who lives in the village of Rakuru, thanked her rescuer heartily. Just then, she shyly asked the stranger what his name was. The protagonist hesitated to answer, realizing that he was also known in that village. After gathering his strength, he answered that his name was Ark. The girl was horrified for a while and recognized who stood before her. Seeing that Mill was shocked, the protagonist explained that everyone knows him as a corpse collector. The girl said confusedly that she had heard of such a man from town rumors. At the same instant, she looked under her feet and saw the rope untied. Her face instantly filled with joy. Mill learned that you shouldn't judge people based on rumors. She confidently stated to Ark that he was completely different from what was being told about him throughout the neighborhood. The protagonist was surprised by this, and he turned around asking what she meant. The girl happily said that he had just saved her life. And even based on that fact, in her opinion, the boy didn't look at all like some kind of corpse collector. Mill smiled and said that for her, Arksan was now a hero. These words of the man he rescued had a profound effect on the boy. All his life he wanted to be an adventurer who saves people from danger. Looking at the girl who had collected a few gold coins in her purse, he said it was time for them to go. Turning his back to Mill, Ark said he would walk the girl to the village. The rescued child asked the boy what he just said. However, the boy said to just follow him. The protagonist thought that, even if only a little, he was happier after all. The travelers progressed down the long corridors toward the exit. Suddenly, a powerful roar was heard ahead, making the blood run cold. Ark turned to Mill and said she needed to sit behind the rocks for a while and keep her head down. Looking ahead again, the boy realized that there were many goblins ahead of him, perhaps even a whole army. The protagonist was not mistaken with his assessment of the situation, and in a few seconds a large squad of monsters appeared in the darkness. Their numbers were very large, and they walked confidently toward the uninvited guests. Drawing his sword and preparing for battle, Ark assessed the makeup of his opponents, counting about 20 level 1 goblins. Mentally, he thought that these goblins had better get ready. Pointing the ball toward his opponents, the guy said those would soon be his level. After these words, the goblins instantly ran towards the boy, waving their weapons and shouting at the top of their voices. Ark immediately went into battle mode, starting to slaughter one monster after another. The speed and strength of the blade allowed it to dominate this battle unchallenged. The protagonist spared no one. It seemed that he was getting even for the years of humiliation he had experienced before. One by one, the goblins' bodies began to turn into an experience. Blobs of energy were directed towards the player time after time, and the system announced the level up. As he continued to chop his opponents to pieces, Ark realized that he was attacking faster and faster thanks to his level increase. In addition, the protagonist developed a reaction that allowed him to immediately interrupt all monster attacks. Suddenly, the kid was attacked from behind by 4 goblins at once. Ark reacted easily to the unexpected situation and soared upwards in one leap. After staying in the air for a few seconds, it once again descended upon the monsters, slicing them one by one. Time after time, the system continued to notify me of the level increase. Now the guy could just have fun with his opponents. Tossing one of the goblins aloft, Ark rushed after him in the next instant. A second later, he sliced that opponent in half as well. The monsters on the ground looked up with some surprise. The boy flashed a glance, determining his next targets. The goblins, seeing the confidence appear on their opponent's face, seemed to realize that they didn't stand a chance. In the next instant, several swift blows wiped out the remaining group. After a couple of seconds, Ark stopped, finding himself among the cut corpses of goblins. The system started recalculating the owner's level and then raised this indicator to 35 units. Mill looked out from behind the rock fearfully and asked the guy if she could come out. However, the main character said that it wasn't time yet. After these words, the girl looked around fearfully, thinking that another monster was lurking somewhere. Suddenly, a loud roar was heard in the distance. Ark looked away, surprised that the Goblin Lord had come only now, after so much of his kin's blood had been spilled. Opposite the boy towered a huge creature holding a huge-sized cleaver in his hand. The goblin was many times larger than Ark. He seemed to be able to crush the protagonist with just one of his feet. The boy decided that now was the moment when he would defeat the Goblin Lord. The monster cocked its head upward and shrieked furiously at the sight of the stranger. Ark shouted. Now he was no longer the weakling who had cowardly fled not so long ago. Immediately after saying that, the Goblin Lord readied his cleaver and swung it around to attack first. The boy shouted again to his soulless opponent not to think the battle would be easy. The moment his opponent swung around to strike, the protagonist attacked first, slashing into the monster's stomach. The creature immediately grabbed the affected spot and shouted in rage throughout the cave. Finding himself behind the enemy's back, the protagonist immediately found himself surrounded by several more smaller goblins. After counting the small monsters, Ark realized that there were no more than 10 of them. Accordingly, they wouldn't be much trouble. With that thought, the boy figured that as long as the Goblin Lord was still alive, he wouldn't want to be distracted by any minnows. That's when the main character called out to Mill and told her to throw knives at him. The girl grabbed a belt of throwing blades from the ground and immediately turned her around. Swinging around, she hurled the unloading belt in the direction of her savior. In flight, Most of the knives fell out of their cells and flew chaotically toward Ark. Mill, realizing that she had made a big mistake, shouted for the guy to excuse her. However, the confident boy said it was all nothing. Moments later, he jumped up and caught 2 daggers while surveying the battlefield. With his first throw, Ark accurately pierced 2 goblins at once. The hero then changed his dislocation slightly to make it more convenient to catch the remaining daggers. Taking aim, he again spotted the monsters standing next to each other, and also killed 2 of them with a single throw. Ark then ran past the remaining 6 goblins, picking up falling blades along the way. A few seconds later, he stopped in front of the crowd, holding the 6 knives he had caught. The protagonist looked at his opponents and muttered that today just wasn't their day. He then added confidently that no one should disturb him when he was at work. Swinging around, Ark shouted that the servants' desire to help their master had only made their situation worse. A second later, the guy swung his arms and released all 6 daggers at once, which struck the remaining 6 goblins. After making sure that all the minnows were dead, the hero reached for his sword again, seeing the notification that his level had been raised to 45. Suddenly, a powerful roar sounded from behind the boy's back. It turned out that the goblin lord, who had already come to the family, found himself behind Ark's back. At the same moment, the monster attacked his opponent. The guy only raised his sword above his head, not even turning to his opponent. In the beginning, the hero thought that since his level was now higher than that big guy's, it should be easier for him. However, the big man seemed to be getting stronger blow by blow. The incessant attacks forced the boy to back off a bit. He didn't understand how the wounded goblin continued to exert such pressure. As a result, the boy backed away, catching his breath and thinking about what he should do next. Suddenly, the armor alerted that the monster had an artifact that increased its performance in battle. In the case of the goblin lord, it was the bracelet on his right arm. That's when Ark saw what the artifact was, and immediately understood everything. After a while, any adventurer has a situation where they can't raise their level as easily. To do this, all adventurers use a variety of artifacts that enhance one or more characteristics. But Ark couldn't even guess that monsters could also use such things to improve their fighting ability. Then the boy prepared for battle and realized that his purpose was now clear. Without destroying this bracelet, he wouldn't be able to win the battle. Therefore, it was necessary to attack the artifact first. The monster once again threw a reckless strike, which Ark easily dodged. Yet after the creature applied the artifact, its speed also increased, and getting the bracelet wouldn't be easy. It looks like the hero is going to have to go all out to win. Ark lunged at the monster once more. The goblin immediately blocked his blow. At the same time, the boy put all his strength into this strike, hoping to break through the block the monster had put up. It was obvious from the high goblin's face that he was having a hard time repelling this attack. At some point, however, he prepared for a counterattack by taking a different position in the prop. At the same instant, he swung with his cleaver, tossing the boy aside. Ark couldn't do anything with that much force and flew off to the side. This time, however, he managed to group himself in midair, and he didn't hurt himself on landing. His attention was drawn to the daggers stuck into the bodies of the minions he had recently killed. Picking up 2 throwing knives, the guy thought of another option to get close to the monster's amulet. As a distraction, he threw a knife at his opponent on the run. The thug easily repelled the throw with the blade of his cleaver. Then Ark threw another blade on the run so he had a chance to get even closer. This time the knife hit the handle of the cleaver, but still did not do any damage to the thug. But the point was just that these throws helped the protagonist get as close to the enemy as possible. Seeing the boy in front of his face, the high goblin held out his cleaver in front of him, blocking the passage to vulnerable areas. After the monster fended off his blow, Ark soared upward, aiming for the final blow. Then the boy flew toward the ground at great speed and was behind the monster's back. As he flew, he muttered that the most important thing in battle was to stay alert. The supreme goblin had time to see the approaching danger. However, it was difficult to react to it. Nevertheless, the creature turned around and tried to block this unexpected attack with its right hand. That's when the guy's blade struck the artifact. Having finished the first phase of the battle, Ark jumped to the ground. The enormous-sized goblin still loomed before him, but his face, however, no longer had such confidence on it. Confident in his future victory, the protagonist muttered that he would not tolerate any surprises now. As a last chance, Ark offered to let the goblin lord escape, at least if he could do so. However, the monster didn't even back up after saying that. On the contrary, he took a few steps towards the boy. The adventurer realized that in such a case the outcome of the fight was already predetermined and rushed towards the thug. Taking advantage of the surprise effect and the speed advantage, Ark flanked and swung his sword. The goblin had time to react to this sudden attack, but now their forces were completely unequal. The now monster flew several dozen meters into the nearest wall after blocking the blow. Blood gushed from his mouth from the force of the blow. Ark walked up to his almost defeated opponent and asked what was the matter now, and was he really afraid of him? The boy shouted that the creature's life was now at stake and threw several swift blows. During one of the attacks, the Goblin Lord dropped his cleaver, which flew off to the side. It was a few meters away and stabbed its blade into the stone floor. Ark looked at his opponent and realized that this was his big chance. If he defeated this huge monster, he would be rid of his weakness and the ridicule of society forever. However, the monster didn't seem to be about to give up and in the next second tried to hit the guy with his fist. However, the boy was ahead of the enemy and plunged his sword into the monster's body first. The huge carcass of the defeated enemy began to fall forward by inertia. Ark said he would be much stronger because of this battle. The big man collapsed to the ground with his whole body, raising a large cloud of dust. Meanwhile, the guy thanked his opponent for the opportunity. Dozens of small clots of energy began to emerge from the monster's body. One by one, they headed towards the hero's body, gradually raising his level. After a while, the system once again recalculated Ark's experience. Now he had reached the 80th level. The boy looked toward the cliff where he was leaving his companion and said she could go out now. The girl walked over and looked in surprise at the carcass of the defeated monster. She could not believe that a man, who everyone around her had recently known as a corpse collector, could now defeat such a powerful creature. Unexpectedly, Mill cheerfully said that Arksan was now the strongest adventurer of the area. Such a title flattered and surprised the lad at the same time. After a while, he began to dismember the monster's huge body. In the end, he managed to take the large fang of the supreme goblin as a nice trophy. Looking longingly at the long-awaited booty, the boy could not believe that the day would come when he would obtain such a rare material. Suddenly, Mill held out her hand and said she could carry all this stuff in her sack. Ark trusted the rescued girl without a second thought, and besides the fang, he also gave her the cursed bone and the sword of the Goblin Lord. The guy thanked the girl for helping him with the materials, to which the companion replied that it was not difficult for her because the boy saved her life. Suddenly, Mill asked what they were going to do with that huge monster body. Ark replied that he had already collected all the good materials that could be extracted from it. Then the hero thought that now with this armor and the new high level, he no longer needed to hide from anyone, and he could safely return to the village. The girl immediately said that if they left even one of the living goblins here, the kidnapping from the village might continue again. These words had a powerful effect on Ark. He realized that now he could earn the village's respect again by saving its girls from the monsters. The boy turned towards the corridors going deep into the cave and asked Mill if she would stay with him a little longer. The girl answered that she didn't mind, but asked where they were going to go. Ark replied that his main concern now was to prevent the kidnappings from continuing. So he decided that the right thing to do would be to kill all the goblins in this cave so they wouldn't bother anyone else. A short while later, the two companions returned to the village. A while later. He was surprised at the fact that he had made a good amount of experience gains in the last 24 hours. When he left the village, he was only level 1, but now he was already level 100. Besides, with so much experience, he was now able to handle almost any monster in the immediate area. The boy glowed at the thought that he could now be called the ultimate adventurer. A tired Mill asked her savior what he had just said, and the boy recounted his thoughts to her. After a few seconds, the girl yelled out that she had never seen adventurers with triple-digit levels in her life. She replied in surprise that the guy was definitely not a newcomer, but instead the strongest adventurer of the village. For his part, Ark couldn't answer anything. He himself had never seen adventurers with such a level. Looking at his companion, the guy said she was absolutely right about everything. It was then that the boy reflected that he must now move on somewhere else, for the local neighborhoods were no longer of such use to him for his pumping. The protagonist recalled how he had shown Mill his ability to absorb opponents' levels. The companion was clearly surprised by this. The girl muttered that with such strength, Arksan could become even much stronger. She smiled sweetly at her rescuer and said she would keep her fist up for him from now on. Suddenly, from the side, someone approached and marveled at the scene taking place in front of him. It was just the adventurer named Jarg with his troop. He said hello to the corpse collector. Ark looked coldly at his opponent and grudgingly greeted him back. The guy with white hair asked his interlocutor rudely, what was that armor he was wearing and where did he get it from? Without waiting for an answer, he chuckled and realized that the boy couldn't rely on his curse and decided to fix that problem with armor. Mockingly, with a wave of his hand, Jarg said that anyone who was ever a corpse collector would always remain trash. The adventurer added confidently that the boy would remain a first-level weakling, and no amount of armor would fix that flaw. However, while his opponent taunted him, Ark wasted no time and decided to move from words to action. A moment later, the protagonist was in front of Jarg, thrusting one of his daggers forward. In the same second, he said he was sick of all this. With a cold look at the arrogant adventurer, Ark said he was bored with all this talk and ordered the boy to shut up. The white-haired guy stared at the weakling, who was now suddenly right in front of him with a knife at the ready. He looked angrily at the boy and said that a freak always stays a trash. A moment later, Jarg snapped out of this threatening state and found himself at Ark's side. An attempted leg kick was unsuccessful, and the protagonist calmly blocked the attack. The devastated Jarg shouted that he wouldn't let some snotty corpse collector get cocky. With those words, he reached for his sword. But no sooner had the lad taken out his blade than he was immediately thrown into a chill by what had happened. Ark was already standing in front of him. The hero anticipated that his opponent would reach for his weapon and immediately knocked the blade out of his hands. Jarg sat on the ground and shouted that this simply couldn't be. His aides had already circled the enemy from behind and had drawn their blades, but they were still hesitant to attack. Ark turned to the adventurers and asked coldly, "Did they really want to try it too?" Both fighters were dumbfounded and did not dare to move. Jarg, sitting on the ground, exclaimed that he was already level 20 and he had been defeated by some corpse collector. He realized that the rumor of his defeat to a first-level weakling would spread throughout the village and town. Upon hearing that Jarg was only level 20, Ark laughed and called his opponent a weakling, saying that he was several times weaker than him. Suddenly, one of the adventurers standing aside, trembling with his whole body, asked his superior to check the level of this weakling. The guy lifted himself off the ground and opened the information panel, not realizing what the problem could be. But what he saw plunged him into the deepest horror. Jarg shook his whole body and couldn't understand why this weakling had suddenly obtained the 100th level. The boy looked up fearfully at the man he had wronged for so many years in a row. In a trembling voice, he asked if it was really true, and how did Ark turn into such a monster? The main character exhaled and said that first everyone called him a corpse collector, and now someone was going to call him a monster. Then he looked with a merry look at his opponents and said that he was only the simplest of lawyers. However, it suddenly appeared that there was no one at the place where Jarg had been sitting a second ago. All three of them ran off without a backward glance, shouting that they didn't want to mess with that monster anymore. He was surprised at how fast they could run when they were in danger. A tired Mill looked at her savior and said that it seemed that Ark had really changed. She smiled sweetly at the guy again and said she was very happy for him. It was as if the girl had a burst of strength, and she ran aside and called the boy after her. Seeing a companion on the village street, Mill suggested that everyone around him spread the word about his new abilities. A few minutes later, the door of the hoarder's store swung open abruptly. The old man looked through the doorway and saw the man everyone knows as the corpse collector. Not holding out any hopes, but peering at the guy's armor, the hoarder said he was willing to listen to suggestions. The boy with a smile on his face walked up to the counter and said he once again wanted to sell materials. When the protagonist came closer, the old man marveled at how the guy had changed in such a short period of time. Still, he looked at the regular visitor and said that the one just shouldn't waste their time, since the kid had probably brought some trash. Nevertheless, Ark did not leave, but instead showed the old man his sack, asking him if he really thought it was trash. The hoarder couldn't believe his eyes at what he saw. He could tell at a glance what kind of artifact the young corpse collector had brought him. The guy who used to bring things no more expensive than a few bronze coins was now holding a large fang of a goblin lord in front of him. The old man took the artifact and examined it with some distrust. Ask him if it was a fake and how did the boy get it? Ark said without hesitation. He came to the dungeon and personally killed that goblin. The stunned old man still said he couldn't take the word of the man who was always carrying his junk around. The guy had a trump card up his sleeve. He called Mill and she confirmed that it was true. To confirm his words, the protagonist completely untied the bag and dumped a bunch of various artifacts and materials on the table. The hoarder practically didn't say a word and just stared at it silently. A satisfied Ark asked the old man if he would buy or if they would go to another person who needed it all more. The guy looked at the jewelry and said there would probably be an easy buyer for such a big score. The old man panicked and immediately shouted that he would buy everything, for it would be sacrilege to refuse such valuable materials. The guy smiled and said he hoped his labors would be appreciated. Immediately afterward, Ark and Mill headed to the market to see the protagonist's grandfather. The old man was overjoyed to see his grandson back after a very long time. However, what was his surprise when the boy showed him a sack full of gold coins? Grandpa couldn't believe what he was seeing and immediately asked his grandson where he got that kind of money. Ark replied that he was finally able to defeat a very strong monster after all. The boy immediately smiled at his relative and congratulated him on the occasion. The old man immediately rushed to hug his grandson. The satisfied guy said that he is really happy that he has now reached the next level. But suddenly the protagonist heard some strange noise behind him. Many villagers crowded around the main gate. They watched with interest what was happening in the field. Ark said he'd be here soon and asked Grandpa and Mill to wait here. Meanwhile, it was turbulent in the pasture. The village was raided by werewolves. These monsters have already managed to break down several fences and bite residents. One of the monsters pounced on a local villager who tried to run away in tears. The girl wouldn't have succeeded if it hadn't been for Ark, who came in time to cut the werewolf in two with a single blow. After tackling the first monster, he asked the woman if she was okay, to which the terrified fellow villager told the guy that she was fine. The boy looked at the remaining werewolves and wondered what they were. Examining the snarling, dog-like monsters, he suddenly thought that it basically didn't matter. Striking a confident pose, he shouted to the werewolves that they didn't belong here, and they shouldn't have come here. Pulling out his sword and pointing it in the direction of the monsters, Ark muttered that these things wouldn't make their way into the village today. After these words, the small group of werewolves was joined by a few more individuals who had previously been prowling around in another part of the village. Looking at the group of level 8 werewolves, the guy thought that it would be advisable to fight them in a non-village area. Many villagers ran away in panic, shouting that it was urgent to call Jarg and his group. And at that moment, Ark remembered that the village's only defenders had just recently fled away. As he looked around the group of werewolves again, he realized that since he had caused Jarg's escape, he would now have to take full responsibility. At the same instant, the first werewolves launched their attack. Dodging the werewolves' swift attacks, the guy thought that since they were level 8, their attacks posed no danger to him. Meanwhile, the monsters gradually began to scatter and, contrary to the protagonist's opinion, did not concentrate the entire attack on him. On the contrary, they spread out to attack the inhabitants. Seeing this, Ark realized that his priority right now was to protect his fellow villagers. If no one intervenes in this massacre, sooner or later all the people will simply be slaughtered. One of the werewolves almost ate the young man, who had no way of resisting the fast and strong monster. However, Ark arrived in time, just seconds before the tragedy, saving someone's life. Looking around, he assessed the situation and chose his next target. Nearby was another werewolf, who was also successfully struck by the protagonist's blade. Standing in a fighting stance and surveying the battlefield, the boy asked the man who had fallen to the ground if he was injured. The shivering villager replied that he was fine. To his great surprise, the lad recognized his rescuer as a corpse collector. Ark replied that he didn't care what they called him, but right now he had a job to do. In the next instant, he rushed to where another group of werewolf had rushed. The protagonist realized that although the other people still considered him a corpse collector, he couldn't just let them all die. Time after time, this situation was repeated. None of the residents who had ever seen the corpse collector believed that this weakling was now saving their village from ruin. The guy had perfected his movements to the point of automatism, managing to help the poor people in the last moments. Most of the werewolves didn't even have time to react to the approaching strong enemy, who hit them clearly in vulnerable points. After hitting the last werewolf, Ark stopped to collect all the levels. To his great surprise, the system increased his rank by another 72 positions. However, by his calculations, there had to be a 10th werewolf still running around somewhere. After killing the entire group of werewolves, the protagonist should have gained 80 levels. It only meant that Ark had missed one of the werewolves, who was now hiding somewhere. When he looked around, he saw that the werewolf had climbed to the roof of the building and had already marked its prey in the form of a little girl. The distance to the target was long, and the protagonist realized that he was unlikely to get there in time. And at the same moment, the monster jumped off the roof and flew towards the defenseless child. There seemed to be no way the guy could protect one person. Upset, he figured that even with such a high level, he still wouldn't be able to save everyone. It was only seconds before the werewolf fell that the girl saw danger approaching from above. There was no way he could accept that, Ark thought. But the only way out of the situation was to try to throw the sword directly into the monster's body. The risk of force majeure was greatly increased, but the boy had no choice. With that thought, he drew his sword and swung it like a dart. Taking quick aim, Ark hurled his blade towards the werewolf. The sword flew towards the falling monster at a tremendous speed. By sheer luck, the blade entered clearly into the monster's throat. The force of the throw threw the werewolf's body into the wall of the house, so that its carcass did not crush the child. The frightened girl squatted down and clutched her head as the main character approached her. The child looked up and saw his savior as a corpse collector. She shyly asked Ark if he was really here to save them all, to which the protagonist replied that he was. The satisfied kid thanked the guy heartily for saving the village. Ark, with a smile on his face, waved his hand to the next person he saved, inwardly rejoicing that he had managed to keep everyone alive. As he looked around, he suddenly realized that the locals now had some serious talk for him. There were a lot of people crowded around him, and all of them had questions. A man in a business suit approached the protagonist, saying that on behalf of the village, he was inviting Ark to talk to him. The boy thought to himself that surely these people would be unhappy with the fact that they had been saved by some pathetic corpse collector. The representative of the delegation turned to Ark with some nervousness. The protagonist, realizing where this was going, turned around and said he had to go, because he realizes that no one here wants to see the face of a corpse collector. But suddenly the man in the business suit asked the guy to wait. Ark turned and asked what else they wanted from him. But suddenly, the man thanked the guy for saving their lives. This turn of events surprised the protagonist very much. People recognized that the guy had done an incredible deed, saving many lives. And all this despite the general dissatisfaction with Ark's work. The guy in the business suit said that thanks to the hero, none of them were hurt, and the boy himself was ready to sacrifice his life to save them all. So on behalf of all the villagers, the man asked the corpse collector to accept their gratitude. This sudden change in his relationship with the villagers really touched Ark. Suddenly, a woman approached the guy, next to whom was a girl, which the hero saved not quite recently. The girl looked at her daughter and also personally thanked her child's savior. This one she bowed to Ark without a hitch. The boy was very embarrassed by this ceremony and asked the woman to raise her head urgently. He added with a smile on his face that all he wanted to do was save everyone and everything worked out the way it was supposed to. The hero turned to the man in the business suit and said that he used to collect loot from corpses, and that, alas, would not change. However, as of late, he has developed a power that allows him to help people. After looking around at the villagers, Ark said that he would now become an adventurer to help the people. So the guy asked his fellow villagers to look out for him as well, and for that he would be grateful to everyone. That day, Ark finally went from a pathetic corpse collector to an adventurer who saved an entire village from destruction. The next morning was equally unremarkable. Sleep-deprived people crowded the streets of the village. A girl in a green dress with a red sash was running down the alley. She barely caught up with the protagonist going about her business. The girl said hello to Ark-san as she walked and wished him a good morning. The guy turned around in surprise and saw Mill, who he hadn't caught after last night. The girl looked at the protagonist in surprise and asked where he had put his beautiful armor. The boy smiled and said that he had been wearing the armor of the abyss all along. In the same instant, he snapped his fingers to demonstrate his recent find. A second later, the main character was wearing all of his armor. He explained to the girl that he had discovered yesterday that he could put on and take off this armor whenever he wanted. The girl clapped her hands and mouthed that it was very cool. Ark looked at his armor again and said with a smile on his face that they were the reason he was able to become a true adventurer. The boy remarked that he had been very lucky when he had found them in the cave. However, the main issue was different. The entire set of uniforms he had found in the dragon's body. But what was the carcass of such a large beast doing in the goblin cave? On the other hand, the boy is unlikely to know the answer to that question anytime soon. Meanwhile, strange events were taking place in the goblin cave. Zharg shouted to his group to move faster and get out of here. The assistants would tearfully run away, begging the boss to help them. But suddenly, something instantly killed them both. Zharg ran, trying not to look back and not realizing what was happening. Losing his mind, he turned around and shouted to the monster across the room what he was forgetting in this low-level cave. This question sounded in the pitch darkness, from which only a huge yellow eye was visible, staring intently at Zharg. Suddenly, the darkness was cut by flashes of electricity. Zharg squatted down, realizing that he could not escape any longer. His whole body trembling, he did not believe that this was the end. Meanwhile, the eye began to concentrate a huge amount of energy into one point. Moments later, a powerful purple energy beam pierced the cavernous darkness, killing Zharg. The rumble of such an explosion was felt even by Ark. Turning around to the direction where the goblin cave was roughly located, he wondered what could have happened there. A few minutes earlier, Zharg's group had been chasing a blue cyclops that was running through the woods near the village. The squad leader lamented that they had almost finished this monster, but now they might miss it altogether. His 16th and 17th level subordinates sped up at the order of their captain. Suddenly, the group saw Cyclops run into the goblin cave. This behavior of the monster surprised all three of them. However, there could also be some disadvantages to it. Zharg was nervous because while the village had been attacked by werewolves, Their group had been elsewhere, and because of that, they had been fined. Accordingly, killing the Cyclops could have boded well for their monetary reward, which could have helped restore the adventurers' financial health. Now their prey was fleeing through the branching dark corridors of the dungeon. Almost at the entrance, the monster smelled a strong odor of rotting flesh. Cyclops immediately headed towards the source of that odor. He soon found himself in a large room where the rotten corpse of a dragon lay. After the odor intensified, the Cyclops' body began to shake. His mouth began to open on its own, and from the looks of it, he could barely restrain himself from pouncing on the dead carcass. The adventurers who entered the corridor heard a chugging sound ahead and headed in the direction of the sound. At a certain point, there was an intimidating sound, not at all like the voice of a Cyclops. Nevertheless, the group continued onward. At some point, all three of them smelled a foul odor of rot. Better ahead of the squad, Jarg was suddenly stunned when he saw an unknown monster in front of him. He asked his subordinates if they saw what he saw. To their great horror, in one branch of the cave, the corpse of a huge monster lay on the ground. A Cyclops lay on top of it, greedily devouring the rotting flesh. Judging by the expression on his face, he was enjoying the action immensely. Suddenly, the guy in the group muttered that something doesn't add up here. Indeed, at a certain point, the Cyclops' body took on an unknown form that no one in the squad had heard of before. Jarg trembled with fear and could not move. For a moment, he thought it was all just a bad dream. A few minutes later, Ark reached the Goblin Cave. As he had expected, all the tracks led to this place. The boy realized that it wasn't just a strange feeling. Here, he felt the presence of something unusual. Everything around him said that the further journey should continue in the cave. For a moment, the protagonist thought he had a special connection to this place. Suddenly, he heard a long roar followed by a scream inside the cave. At this point, the hero tensed up a lot. It became clear that this was not an ordinary case. Walking down the main corridor, Ark plugged his nose. The smell from inside the cave was getting stronger and stronger. There should be a dragon corpse just ahead. But what the guy saw at the corpse scene shocked him beyond belief. Opposite him stood a Cyclops of enormous size. 2 human corpses lay at his feet, and he held the third on his outstretched arm. Still, this creature was very different from the usual Cyclops. For unknown reasons, it had small wings on the back. As soon as the protagonist entered the hall, the monster immediately noticed him. He was no longer interested in the victim he was holding in his hand. The monster threw the corpse into the wall with incredible force. The monster then turned towards Ark and looked at him fiercely. Its body was of phenomenal size. The boy thought that there was no such thing as such a large Cyclops. The protagonist did not expect such a strong and frightening aura. He had not encountered such demons of such a strange form. However, the boy thought that he didn't care right now, because he was already 180th level, and with such a level, it was impossible to lose. Ark decided that the best defense was offense, so he decided to attack first before this monster regained his senses. Suddenly, the armor suggested that the difference in level between the wearer and the creature was too great, and any battle was recommended to be avoided. The protagonist was greatly surprised and confused by this news. In the same instant, before he knew it, the monster gave him the strongest blow to his chest. Ark had never experienced this kind of pain before, and this blow shocked him greatly. The protagonist's body flung backwards a few meters into the wall without a word. Falling to the ground, the boy barely tried to get up. His entire body was trembling and aching. He didn't understand how such superiority was possible in such a low-level cave. The system opened an information panel with a recommendation to view the monster's level. It was a waste that Ark hadn't checked his opponent's level first. What he saw shocked him. Opposite him was a creature called the Cyclops of the Abyss. It was currently at level 200. At the same time, the armor warned that the enemy was accumulating a huge amount of energy in the head area. The system recommended an urgent retreat, but Ark didn't have the strength to even get to his feet. The repeated requests from the system and armor for the main player to immediately retreat did not stop, and the monster only seemed to give it a chance. Ark tried to get to his feet with great difficulty. But even if he had gotten up, it would hardly have changed the final outcome. The boy could not believe that he had once again come to this cave that was once again trying to take his life. Suddenly, the system started counting down the seconds until the monster's control shot. 7 seconds before the attack, the guy used his sword to pull himself up. However, there was no strength for further movements. It was the maximum that Ark's body could produce at that moment. After a time, the monster emitted a strongest energy beam from its forehead. The flow of energy did not penetrate the main character's body through, but it fried him and threw him aside. The guy flew off to the other end of the cave and once again typed into the wall. It seemed as if his whole body was fractured. The boy was still trying to keep his eyes open, but it was getting harder by the second. A few seconds before passing out, Ark realized that now he had definitely lost. After the Cyclops stopped emitting a beam of energy, he looked at the defeated enemy. Suddenly, he turned around and headed towards the exit of the cave. Some time passed before the protagonist woke up again. He got up on all fours with great difficulty, thinking about what had happened and why he was still alive. The system alerted that the enemy had left the cave, mistaking Ark for a dead man. After hearing the news, the boy thought that the monster was definitely mistaken, although the boy himself was close to death. The armor alerted the host that he was badly injured and needed to use potions to recover. Ark thought he'd completely forgotten about those flasks he'd picked up here in the goblin dungeon. Pulling a vial out of his pouch, the guy immediately emptied it. The elixir took effect almost instantly, and a few seconds later the protagonist was on his feet. Wiping his lips, he mentally thanked the goblins for their potions. Looking towards the exit, the guy realized that this monster definitely needed to catch up. Otherwise, if this Cyclops reached the village, he could safely single-handedly slaughter all the inhabitants there. Suddenly, a human voice behind him called out to the corpse collector. Ark, who was slowly beginning to wean himself off that nickname, stopped. In addition, the voice of the caller was very familiar. The protagonist turned around to see where the sound was coming from. Directly across from him, leaning against the wall, lay Jarg. He was bleeding profusely, and there was a huge hole in the center of his stomach. Suddenly, the adventurer spoke sharply as he noticed the potions Ark was drinking and demanded that he be given one vial. The white-haired guy shouted that for a weakling like a corpse collector, a regenerating elixir was too valuable an item. Jarg looked towards Ark with mad eyes and muttered that as soon as he drank the elixir, he would immediately escape. After all, that monster must have gone to the village, and as long as it was distracted, he would be able to survive. Then he demanded the elixir in a commanding tone. Ark continued to remain silent, and Jarg tried in agony to get the brat to get some restorative potions from the brat. Suddenly, he spit up blood, and his breathing hitched. The boy was silent again. He seemed to have less and less strength left for persuasion. After a few seconds, Jarg lowered his head again and began begging Ark for mercy. The pain was unbearable, he said. The protagonist gave a meaningful silence, and then asked the Abyss Armor if these potions could heal such wounds. Armor replied that there was no point, as the wounded man had lost a lot of blood. Besides, the creature had managed to inflict too much lethal damage on Jarg, and even using potions would result in a 0 chance of survival. The armor predicted the guy would die within minutes from massive blood loss. Ark was silent again, and asked the armor the question that had plagued him for a long time. The protagonist asked if the level absorption skill worked on humans, to which he received an affirmative answer from the armor. Now, if he didn't find the strength to rise to his feet, he would definitely be finished. After that, the protagonist told his opponent that there was nothing he could do to help him. The blond man grinned and said that he had realized it a long time ago. Jarg shuddered and said he just wanted this pain to finally end. Ark looked at the boy pityingly and said that he had one way to put him out of his misery. At the same moment, the boy interrupted the corpse collector again and said that he wasn't stupid and already understood everything. Then he looked at Ark and said that he would have to kill him. The protagonist replied to Jarg that in truth, he had hated the man all his life. And yet, looking back on the past, the guy will somewhat miss those times. Then Ark swung his blade, and the system alerted to the absorption of Jarg's level. The armor wielder had reached level 200. Meanwhile, the Cyclops walked through the forest without any obstacles. After a while, the roofs of the houses appeared behind the trees. The monster approached the outskirts of the village. However, he suddenly cried out loudly, and his face turned into a grimace of pain. The monster heard a human voice rejoicing that he had made it in time. Ark, who was running at high speed, managed to catch up to the Cyclops and struck the monster in a leap. The guy blocked the path of his opponent, who clutched his bleeding hand in horror. The protagonist decided not to hesitate to take advantage of the advantage he had, and lunged at the Cyclops again. As he approached the monster, Ark looked at his opponent in rage and said that he would have to die by his hand. The guy then delivered a powerful slashing blow with his sword, but the monster managed to block the blow. The boy again stepped back some distance and, drawing his blade towards the Cyclops, advised the latter that he should finish off his enemies. Ark added that because of the monster's gaff, they now have the same level. He then suggested that this fight should end, and finally reveal the winner. Unexpectedly, the protagonist said that he forgot to add that he had recently killed his old acquaintance with the same hand, so now he was out of rage. A moment later, the Cyclops came to attack first and pounced on Ark. It seemed that with his huge carcass, he would simply run over the young adventurer. But as soon as the monster blinked, he saw that the young man was already on his shoulder. Ark was clearly outmatched in speed, which he took advantage of by getting into an advantageous position and counterattacking. Coming in from the back, he attacked the Cyclops, attempting to cut the monster's back. However, the creature's powerful wings were much stronger than the protagonist thought. This only suggested that some other tactic should have been used. At the same moment, the monster once again began to focus its vision to attempt a powerful shot. Ark noticed this and immediately lashed out at his opponent, shouting that he would not allow something like this to happen again. But suddenly the monster stopped storing energy near its forehead and looked fiercely at the protagonist. The boy realized too late that it was a trick. At the same instant, the Cyclops straightened his legs sharply, hitting the guy and throwing him back a few meters. The protagonist managed to block this counterattack, but now he had to defend himself. The monster immediately ripped the nearest tree from its roots and swung it around to try to kill Ark. The protagonist had no time to react to this unexpected move and parried the blow. After flying a great distance, Ark fell, hitting his back on the ground. The guy was still conscious and didn't understand why. Despite the equality of levels, he couldn't overpower the monster. Taking out a vial of regenerating liquid from his pocket and drinking it, he was surprised at the same time that this monster had also used a ruse. Still, having regained his health, Ark rose to his feet and thought that this time he would not let the Cyclops win. The boy once again pounced on the monster. The armor again alerted to the huge energy buildup and recommended immediate retreat. The protagonist decided to trust his own instincts, at the same time surprised that this monster still does not calm down. However, this time the Cyclops wasn't bluffing. A few seconds later, he fired a powerful shot, but this time Ark was ready for anything. It was not without difficulty that he dodged the powerful beam of energy. The boy maintained his speed and, once in a favorable position, swung his sword in hopes of delivering the final blow. After making sure the attack didn't work, the Cyclops decided to cover himself with his wings. It didn't help, however, as Ark put all his strength into his punch. The monster screamed in horror as he realized his wings had been cut. The protagonist saw the result of the attack, realizing that he had finally succeeded in injuring the creature. However, the boy then looked warily at the monster. He was very much surprised by the way the Cyclops behaved in this situation. After the monster realized the danger, it began to stare intently towards the village. Then Ark realized to his horror that the Cyclops was going to switch to buildings and inhabitants. In that same second, the monster tensed its legs hard, breaking the ground beneath it. He then made a swift leap with incredible speed. Falling to the ground time after time, he kept moving towards the buildings. Then the protagonist realized that the Cyclops wanted to kill all the villagers to regain his strength. The guy started stalking, realizing he didn't have much time. Now, because of his procrastination, the village was in mortal danger. A short while later, residents walking peacefully through the streets discovered a strange creature in the sky. A moment later, it crashed to the ground with a clatter, scaring away the people gathered around it. After the dust cleared, the monster looked around for a few seconds. Then the Cyclops raised his head up and let out a terrible howl, terrifying the villagers. Ark was on the spot a few seconds later. He saw the monster moving down one of the streets. The guy realized he was late after all. At the same instant, Cyclops hit one of the nearby buildings with all his might. Residents panicked and ran in different directions, begging for mercy. At the same time, the creature began to accumulate energy near its forehead to use the energy beam again. Ark didn't understand how a Cyclops could use this ability so many times in a row. But before the guy knew it, the strongest discharge had pierced several buildings. Only then did the hero finally manage to catch up with the enemy, ending up on one of the rooftops. The guy lunged at the monster in a rage, yelling that it was time for him to stop. Cyclops turned around and tried to block the attack, but Ark managed to get back up, flying under his opponent's arm. The protagonist found himself backstabbing into the creature, confident that this time he definitely hit it. The monster turned around, hoping to see the boy behind him, but he was no longer there. Ark soared into the air in an attempt to attack the monster from above. Given the previous fights, it could be decided that the only vulnerable spot of this monster was still its eye. The protagonist spiked toward the Cyclops at great speed, but the Cyclops managed to parry the blow with his arm. It seemed as if the blade of the blade was about to pierce through the monster's voice. Annoyed, Ark leaned on his opponent's arm and bounced upwards to try and strike again. He swung his sword again, shouting that he would definitely save his village, even if he had to die to do so. However, the Cyclops this time was fully prepared for the attack. Moreover, he had once again accumulated energy near his eye. The next moment, the monster suddenly fired, barely hitting the protagonist. The guy was surprised that the creature was able to prepare a new attack so quickly. Ark made a successful comeback, but now he was back in a vulnerable position. Looking to the side, the protagonist saw that the monster immediately pounced on him again, as the boy had no time to react. The Cyclops threw the village defender to the ground with a powerful blow. Convinced that he had bought enough time, the monster headed towards the center of the settlement, bouncing off the roofs of buildings. Ark lay in the center of a large crater. He couldn't seem to move at all. Apparating with the last of his strength, he whispered that he wasn't done yet. Overcoming the pain, the guy got to his feet and mouthed that only he could overpower such a strong demon. So no matter what it took, he couldn't give up. In the middle of the central square, an old merchant looked up into the sky with astonishment. Right in front of him stood the very same Cyclops, who was several times the height of the resident. The next moment, the monster glared fiercely at the merchant and roared loudly. The old man thought dejectedly that there was nowhere to run away in this small village. No matter how far you go, they will catch up with you. So now the only thing left for him to do is to buy time for the others. But then the merchant heard the stomping of footsteps behind him and realized that this was the end of his work. In the next second, the protagonist appeared between the dweller and the Cyclops. Drawing his sword, Ark looked confidently into the monster's single eye. Then the guy turned toward his grandfather and said that a ragamuffin like him couldn't be a hero. The merchant looked at the boy with a smile and said that his grandson had come to the rescue just because he was a real hero. Ark looked at the Cyclops again and muttered that nevertheless, he did not know how to defeat this creature. Suddenly, the old man muttered that the equality of their levels didn't matter. The boy looked toward the merchant again. He was rummaging through one of the overturned crates, saying that his grandson didn't need to think about it so much. The next second, the old man threw something at the protagonist. Looking at the object thrown by his relative, the guy couldn't believe his eyes. In his hand was a very ordinary loaf of bread. It was the kind the boy had eaten when he was the most common corpse collector. The merchant looked at Ark enigmatically, asking if the past days were different from what was happening now. While the boy was cracking open the loaf, the old man said that both then and now it was horrible and scary. After saying those words, the protagonist confidently looked into the monster's eye. Ark looked confidently in front of him and thanked his grandfather for helping him gather his thoughts. The boy then readied his sword for battle once more and changed before the Cyclops for making him wait so long. At that moment, it became clear to both opponents that the coming bout would be decisive. Deciding to start the fight first, the protagonist attacked the demon. The monster waited for the first strike while Ark tried to make false maneuvers. After a while, the guy attacked, however, the Cyclops blocked the attempt with the same ease. Still, this strike was part of the plan. This way, Ark managed to get to the side of the monster. Suddenly, however, the creature reacted instantly, turning around and grabbing the guy's blade. The boy was once again amazed at how easily this demon fended off his lightning-fast attacks. Cyclops swung around, holding Ark by the sword. The monster then hurled his opponent with such force that he flew to the other end of the village. After doing a few somersaults on the ground, the guy managed to keep his balance and get back into a fighting stance. He realized once again that he didn't understand how he could defeat this monster. Suddenly, a child's crying from behind made Ark turn around. Behind the protagonist's back stood a boy who was shaking in terror at the sight of the demon. The boy was angry at the thought that someone had forgotten a child in such a dangerous place. Ark shouted excitedly to the boy to get out of here faster. The child mouthed in a trembling voice that he was scared and couldn't bring himself to move. Meanwhile, the Cyclops noticed that his opponent was paying attention to the boy standing aside. Then his gaze shifted to the defenseless child. In the same second, the monster leaped towards the boy with great speed, causing him to lose his balance and fall to the ground. Then the creature swung its fist, intending to flatten the child with one blow. The young resident covered himself with his hands in terror, screaming at the top of his voice. However, an instant before the blow struck, Ark was in front of the Cyclops' fist, shouting that there was no way he was going to let that happen. It seemed that the monster had put all of its strength into this blow. However, the protagonist was still standing. After the creature removed its hand, the boy sat down on his knee. He could see that his strength was almost at an end. The next second, Ark told the kid that he needed to get out of here now. The boy tried to say something against it, but the protagonist interrupted him by muttering that he was almost unable to move. The Cyclops was already preparing to give him the final blow. Seeing this, the protagonist turned to the child again, telling him that he was a brave boy and should make himself leave this place. The boy shifted a little, saying through his tears that he would not be afraid anymore. The child then turned around and ran with all his might away from the battlefield, leaving the exhausted Ark alone with the Cyclops. The protagonist immediately smiled and praised the boy for his courage. Then he raised his head and looked at his opponent again. The monster towered victoriously over the nearly defeated lad and prepared for the final blow to end the confrontation. The Abyss armor once again alerted the wearer to the large energy buildup and offered to retreat immediately. Ark apologized, however, saying that it had already been resolved. He looked tiredly in front of him, stating that he was not getting out this time. At the same second, Cyclops shot the protagonist. The only thing Ark could do at that moment was to try to cover himself with his sword. The impact of the energy beam pierced several houses from the walls in the village. The chaos and destruction left no chance for any of the objects that came across the path. The guy's body flew a few blocks and crashed into the wall of a house. Ark looked through the huge hole he had made and thought there was nothing he could do to counteract this incredible power. He was surprised to think that despite being of the same level, the difference in strength somehow was still too great. The armor recommended the hero to heal urgently. The boy thought of healing potions and looked in his pocket. However, it suddenly appeared that the bag was completely empty. Looking in front of him, Ark realized he had confused all the flasks on impact. He reached a trembling hand forward, hoping to find the strength to get up and crawl over to the potion. However, suddenly his eyes rolled back. At that moment, Ark's strength finally left him. The arm fell to the ground helplessly, and the protagonist lost consciousness. After a while, the guy felt an unprecedented lightness. When he opened his eyes, he wondered where he'd gotten to. The boy looked down at his hand and thought that the village must have been destroyed by now. Ark blamed himself for not finding the strength to recover. If he had, he would have been able to save all the villagers. Pulled his hand toward the light and begged for someone to help him in time. Suddenly, Ark woke up. There was a flask of potion on his left cheek, and it was slowly flowing into his mouth. The guy looked tiredly in front of him and saw a girl squatting in front of him and looking into the hero's face. Seeing that the protagonist had woken up, the beauty clapped her hands. Ark pulled himself up and asked his savior who she was and what her name was. The resident looked into the hero's eyes and said her name was Lyra. She explained that she was born and raised in this village. She added that she also wants to save the place and its inhabitants. At the same second, the monster from a few blocks away roared furiously again. Looking at Ark rising to his feet, Lyra said he urgently needed to get back into the fight. That's when the girl confessed that she had already seen the guy fighting to protect this village. Unexpectedly, the beauty said that many people want to save the place, and despite everything, the residents are very grateful to the hero. Lyra then held out her hand to the boy and motioned for him to run away from here. The boy was greatly surprised by this offer, and he refused, saying that he was the only one in this village who could defeat this monster. Lyra folded her hands in front of her then, saying that was the whole reason. Such an answer surprised Ark greatly, and he looked at the girl for a while longer, unable to say anything. The pretty girl asked the guy what would happen if he lost to this monster. Without waiting for an answer, she said that at this rate, nothing could save this village. Indeed, already many buildings in the settlement were already on fire or destroyed. Just a little more, and the monster could completely destroy the place. Lyra said that Ark should avoid seeing the cyclops until his wounds heal. The boy, still not believing what he was hearing, tried to pull himself up again. However, his whole body ached and kind of wouldn't let him do it. It looked like he would really have to rest before fighting at full strength. Suddenly, the monster was right in front of Ark's face in one leap. Lyra held out her hand to the boy that second, telling him that they needed to hurry. The protagonist looked at the cyclops for a while longer, deciding what he should do next. Clamming up, he shouted that he had already figured it out. Then the guy made up his mind after all and held out his hand to the girl. After that, Lyra pulled Ark behind her, yelling to keep up with her. Reaching one of the narrow passages between the houses, the girl turned left. After they successfully sneak away from the cyclops, the protagonist asks Lyra how she knows his name. The pretty girl, turning into one of the alleys again, said that the guy was very popular in this village. Annoyed, Ark asked, "Did everyone still think of him as a corpse collector?" Suddenly, the girl stopped and said without so far. However, Lyra then looked into the boy's eyes and said that she thought he was a hero. The young resident said she was also there at the time of the werewolf attack. The protagonist remembered that day in horror. It was then that Ark realized that perhaps without noticing it, he had saved that girl's life. Just then, Lyra smiled and said she was sure of him. The beauty then glared and mouthed that she thought Ark-san could save this village. These words had a strong effect on the protagonist. Putting his fist forward, the guy said that he would definitely kill this into a monster. With a confident look in the beauty's eyes, Ark added that he would save their village. Suddenly, a shrill, human-like scream was heard not far from the companions. The girl and the boy turned to the direction where the sound was coming from and were surprised. The monster shouldn't have gotten here yet. After running through a few turns, the guys saw an unknown man in a cloak dragging a girl by the hair while hurrying his accomplices. Inside the wide, looped courtyard were two wagons. There were several people in identical clothing around, and no one prevented the kidnapping. The unknown cloaked man shoved the girl to his subordinates, telling them that they needed to get out quickly, as the monster was already getting closer. The type then arched a satisfied voice, shouting that even if they openly kidnapped people, no one would stop them. Laughing at the top of his voice, he mouthed that the perfect couple had come to make a little extra money. The protagonist hid behind the wall, nervously noting that the worst moment simply couldn't have been worse. Another bandit, carrying someone's jewelry, said they were now allowed to take whatever they could carry. Peeking out from behind the stone wall, Lyra grudgingly noted that this was simply inhumane. But suddenly the girl's gaze changed abruptly, and she looked excitedly at the hero. Meanwhile, the guy was still examining the wagons. After a few seconds, he turned to Lyra and asked her to wait while he dealt with those bandits. Immediately, however, the protagonist sensed something amiss and turned around sharply. Right next to him stood the bulky man who had taken the young lady hostage. He put his huge hand around the captive's neck and held something sharp to her head. Ark looked at Lyra's frightened face in panic. The big guy immediately said that if the guy didn't want this wench to get hurt, he needed to drop his weapon now. Seeing that the boy was serious, the bandit said not to do anything stupid. Realizing there was no other option, Ark lowered his weapon, saying he understood perfectly. The big man then used his other hand to shove the protagonist aside the circular plaza. The squad leader turned around and asked a subordinate, "Who are these two?" Then the type in the trench coat said that he had warned his goons that they didn't want men. But immediately he saw that in addition to some brat, the big guy had brought a girl. Noting the captive's lovely facial features, the bandit said it was a very nice specimen. Moving closer, the ringleader examined Lyra's body, saying that this was a pretty good girl. Squatting down, he looked into the captive's face, saying that they could sell her for a pretty good price. But suddenly the squad leader was interrupted by the protagonist, who had been standing silent until then. Ark asked the bandits how they had the nerve to do such things while the village was in danger. However, the type in the cloak said that he and his boys cared deeply about what would become of this settlement by its inhabitants, all because they originally came to this place to completely loot the village. Approaching the boy closely, the ringleader said they were lucky they hadn't interrupted them before. The protagonist amplified his aura and called the bandits bastards in a rage. The cape type said he wasn't scared at all. The ringleader looked at Ark and asked if the latter was an adventurer. Receiving no answer, but understanding everything perfectly, the bandit said that the boy looked pathetic. After all, even with such tremendous power, the guy can't do anything about the situation. After mocking the loser, the leader said it was time for them to move out. Turning to the bulky man, he told him to be more careful with this girl. All because none of them wanted an outsider to interfere with their shady dealings. Ark was furious, thinking that if he had the chance, he'd massacre those bastards in a second. That's when the guy decided that as soon as the perfect moment appeared, he would definitely save Lyra. But suddenly a knife blade flashed in a nearby passage. Someone took small steps and ran toward the bandits who had turned away. The ringleader, who heard a strange stomping behind him, turned around to see what was going on. Seeing danger approaching, he ordered his big man to be more careful. Toward the huge bandit, screaming furiously, ran a girl who had dashed out of the alley. The bald bandit turned around and looked at the girl with incomprehension. The protagonist was horrified to discover that it was Mill. The big man easily dodged the blow, tripping the girl who was running at him. Emil couldn't help herself and plopped to the ground with all her might. The thug looked at the desperate resident in surprise and said she couldn't beat him. But Mill looked up and gave the bandit a satisfied look, saying that she hadn't intended to kill anyone. That's when the bandit finally stopped understanding what this girl wanted. But in the same second, Mill shrieked that she was just bait. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Ark approaching him from behind at breakneck speed. However, even turning around, the bandit had no time to do anything about the new danger. There was incredible rage built up inside the protagonist, and he unleashed all of his emotions in one powerful attack. With one mighty blow, Ark knocked down the bulky man, who immediately lost consciousness. Stopping, the guy saw Lyra fly upwards. After that, he calmly caught the captive in his arms. Looking into the eyes of the still stunned girl, the protagonist said that she should hide now. Seeing this incredible audacity, the squad leader drew his saber, ordering the bandits to kill the brat while keeping a lookout. The thugs immediately surrounded Ark on all sides, while keeping a relatively safe distance and hesitating to attack. The guy who didn't have a gun on him suddenly asked if they really wanted it, because he wasn't going to restrain himself. The cloaked ringleader laughed and shouted that they were not afraid of a goon who pretended to be a hero. Ark calmly replied that he was giving everyone one last chance to lay down their weapons and leave. However, none of the thugs listened to him. At the same second, all the thugs attacked the protagonist at the same time. The boy looked up into the sky and said he understood perfectly. He then examined the thug who lay unconscious on the ground and said that his words were correct. Ark looked at his enemies and said that there was no way they could defeat him because they had too much difference in level. After saying that, only a few seconds passed. The protagonist tore apart all the thugs with his bare hands. After each victory, the armor notified a new level absorption. At the end, out of all the enemies, only the gang leader was left. He held out a trembling hand toward the unknown guy and said that adventurers were never that fast. Ark, you picked up his sword in the heat of battle and said that unfortunately for the bandits, he was no mere adventurer. With eyes full of rage, he examined the rogue and said that he possessed a level 200. After saying that, the gang leader realized that he had no chance left. Shouting insults at his opponent, he lunged at the bastard in desperation. The protagonist then killed the remaining target with one swift strike. The system notified him of his upgrade to level 250, adding that the wielder had reached the maximum level for a human. Ark was very much surprised by those words. He was not aware that this was the maximum limit. What also surprised him about this wording was that the level limit for humans existed at all. On the other hand, he had also never heard of those adventurers who had reached such a high level before. Suddenly, a woman's voice called out to Ark, and he turned around. Before he knew it, Lyra was pouncing on him with a hug. The girl looked at the protagonist with happy eyes and thanked him for saving her. Ark put his hand on Lyra's shoulder and said that he would never leave her. He added that he will never forget the way the girl gave him the potion at a critical moment. The boy reminded her that if it wasn't for her help, he would have been killed by the monster long ago. Suddenly, the pretty girl took the boy by the cheeks and looked him in the eyes. She said that Ark-san is now the greatest hero to her. These words touched the boy very much. After looking over the bodies of the men he had killed, he was surprised that someone would call him a hero after what he had done. Pulling away from Lyra's hands, Ark said, hardly worthy of that praise. Looking at the corpses of the bandits again, he said that still, if he had left them alive, those bastards could have ravaged other villages. With a frustrated clench of his fist, the boy added that these thoughts were constantly running through his head. He realized that if he didn't stop them, things could only get worse. Suddenly, Lyra muttered that it wasn't his fault. The protagonist looked at the girl in bewilderment. She once again repeated what she had said, but this time much more seriously. Lyra pointed out to the guy that he had taken the lives of these people to save the people of his village. She looked calmly into the boy's eyes and said there was no need to blame himself, for he had done the right thing. At the end, the girl added that this is why she considers Ark her hero. The boy once again thanked Lyra for her words and said he felt better. The pretty girl smiled and said she was happy to help. Unexpectedly, Mill interrupted the conversation, saying that all the people caught by the bandits had already returned to their homes. Ark patted the girl on the head, telling her she was doing a good job. Mill whirled around herself, saying she was glad to have been of help. She then added that while Ark-san was fighting, she had no way to help. Suddenly, Mill blurted out, telling the protagonist that she was ready to fight alongside him next time. The boy, meanwhile, looked seriously in the direction from where the explosions were heard and said he was already fine. At the same second, at the other end of the village, a cyclops was advancing towards the protagonist, destroying a building. Ark turned to his companions and said they had somewhere to hide already. Armor immediately turned to the protagonist, saying that since he had reached level 250, he would be able to handle that creature. The boy looked confidently in the direction from which the monster was approaching and thought that now, at last, the perfect conditions were at hand. A moment later, the cyclops once again soared into the sky. From a great height, he found Ark among the buildings and the girls standing beside him. Surprised that this boy is still alive, the monster decided to finally finish him off by landing not far from the protagonist. Lyra and Mill shielded themselves with their arms from the rocks and shingles flying at them. Ark, meanwhile, readied his weapon and looked seriously at his opponent. The monster loomed menacingly over the buildings. The boy headed toward the enemy, intending to end it at last. Finally, he turned around and once again told the girls that they had better hide more securely. Both companions listened to this warning without moving and regarded the monster with horror. Then they turned around and quickly ran in the opposite direction. Ark immediately turned to the Cyclops, apologizing for what he had to avoid in their previous encounter. But the same guy added that he had no intention of escaping this time. Glaring furiously at the monster, the protagonist said that they would end it here and now. After these words, the creature roared loudly. The walls of the neighboring houses cracked from that powerful sound, but the guy didn't budge. Gathering his thoughts, he slowly began to move towards his opponent. Ignoring the crumbling debris, Ark said that he couldn't even wield a sword before. Immediately, bitter memories of his past when he was a social outcast and a weakling no one wanted surfaced in his mind. The hero then drew his weapon, saying that he then swung his sword for the first time to save his life. He then added that after his rebirth, he had to fight to protect his home. The boy then pointed his blade at the Cyclops and said that he ended up in this very moment. All the memories he had experienced over the past 2 hard days popped into Ark's mind. After that, the guy glared fiercely at the enemy. His eyes seemed to be burning with hatred. Swinging his sword, Ark added that he was now using his skills to fulfill the hopes of his friends. After saying that, the aura of the protagonist increased several times. He looked confidently at his opponent and said that he had better get ready. The young adventurer muttered that now the Cyclops would have to feel the blow of someone who had surpassed all human limits. At the same time, the monster was also determined to fight. The monster once again screamed with incredible strength. The Cyclops then decided to attack first. Breaking through the house, he burst into the courtyard area and swung his arm to hit the protagonist. However, the guy drew his sword and repelled this monster's attack with one swing, throwing the enemy back. Then Ark muttered that the Cyclops' blows were completely useless against him. Saying this, the boy pounced on his opponent and launched a swift attack into the hulking, bulky man's body. The demon did not expect such a strong blow and was unable to block it. While the monster's body was flying helplessly in the air, the main character seemed to be calmly moving around it. Finding himself on top of the enemy, Ark spun on the flying Cyclops and with a kick to the stomach sent the enemy's body into the ground. All the monster can do is just scream in panic, trying to do something. After the demon's body hit the ground, a large cloud of dust rose into the air. The protagonist stood across the street waiting for the dust to clear. Suddenly, the Cyclops jumped up and instantly concentrated a huge amount of energy near his forehead to shoot at the guy. However, to the monster's surprise, it was as if the boy had no intention of running away. The armor alerted the arch to a large buildup of energy nearby. However, the host said there was nothing to worry about. Pulling out his sword, the guy said that he wouldn't have any problems with it because in this world, everything is decided by level. To the hero's great surprise, the monster still hadn't killed a single person by that point, remaining at the same 200th level. A few moments later, the Cyclops fired a shot at Ark. As the energy beam approached, the boy still didn't move. He then swung his sword, saying that he didn't care what the creature did. Ark sliced through the air in front of him, scattering an energy beam in the process. Judging from the expression on Cyclops' face, at that moment he was greatly surprised that someone had not just dodged his attack, but parried it. The guy once again pointed his blade at the monster, saying that he couldn't win because of the huge difference in level. It was slowly starting to get dark outside. The two opponents were still facing each other. Arch's face was still as calm as ever. At the same time, the Cyclops seemed to be getting nervous. He once again let out a violent scream, glaring fiercely at his opponent. The boy suddenly asked the monster, was it really scared? After that, the Cyclops suddenly stopped screaming and stared at the protagonist. Ark said that the monster used to feel powerful, scaring the civilians. But now it was his turn to be trampled. The adventurer then looked into his victim's face and said that he should not be surprised. In the next second, the guy rushed towards the creature with incredible speed. Noticing this, Cyclops realized that he should do something about it. The monster let out a mighty roar and rushed to counterattack Ark. My hero calmly maneuvered away from the Cyclops' strike and delivered a counterstrike to the back of his head. The monster, unable to match the power of this attack, fell to the ground. Raising his head, the demon saw Ark standing across from him. In desperation, he tried his favorite attack again. The protagonist looked at these futile attempts to fight back with indifference and asked his opponent, did he still not realize that he had no chance? After that, the guy strengthened his aura again and said that he would now show the monster true despair. The boy didn't bother to dodge the enemy's attack, but suddenly, the energy beam embedded in the boy's body turned around and hit the ground next to the monster. The creature opened its mouth in surprise and looked at its opponent. Ark stood still, watching as the force of the blow knocked the monster off its feet. The Cyclops' eye was boiling. He seemed to put all his strength into this last attack. However, his enemy was still intact. He stood with his arm outstretched toward the monster. The protagonist then asked his opponent if he realized the hopelessness of the situation. Cyclops devoured the boy's gaze that said the difference between them was insurmountable. Suddenly, the creature bowed its head and seemed to accept this outcome. But suddenly, the demon looked up again and screamed with all his might. Ark was no longer impressed by this demarche. It seemed to him that the monster didn't want to accept his defeat at all. Clenching his fist, the bulky man once again pounced on the protagonist with another attack. However, as expected, his punch landed in the ground as the guy dodged with ease. After that, the creature, instantly accumulating energy near its forehead, once again released an energy beam at Ark. But the boy jumped upward, once again leaving the monster with nothing. Then the Cyclops raised his head upward, continuing to guide the beam behind the dodging protagonist. However, the guy easily evaded that shot and ended up near his opponent's head. The demon put his arm out in front of him again, hoping that it could block the main character's blow. However, the guy swung his sword so hard that any attempts to block this attack were futile. At the same instant, a piece of the Cyclops' arm flew aside, splattering blood. The creature thrust its stump upward and screamed in pain. Ark once again jumped back to a safe distance after this successful attack. Then he swung his sword and said he was bored with this, and it was time to call it a day. Looking fiercely into the monster's single eye, Ark ordered it to its knees. A second later, it seemed to the guy that his opponent understood the request. And, judging by the look on his face, he didn't like it very much. The Cyclops swung its head at the same instant, and throwing an energy beam in different directions, tried to hit the protagonist. Seeing these desperate attempts to stop the irreversible, the boy said it was too late to do anything. After that, he easily made his way through the continuous attacks to his opponent and delivered a slashing blow. After this attack, Ark once again moved to a safe distance and the monster fell to its knees. The Cyclops then looked up and saw the protagonist leaping to deliver the final blow. With his one eye, he saw death approaching. The boy shouted that he had hurt a lot of people, and now it was time to pay the bill. The demon had no strength or power left to parry the attack. The next instant, Ark's sharp blade sank into the monster's eye. Thus, the monster, despite its unwillingness to accept defeat, died kneeling in front of the humanoid. The armor immediately announced the inability to absorb the level and unlocked the transformation skill. This ability allows one to go beyond the human's limits. Just after morning came, residents assessed the damage the village had sustained during this difficult battle. People immediately began rebuilding the buildings damaged in yesterday's attack. A guy in a blue t-shirt was sitting on the roof and tapping the shingles with a mallet. At the same time, he saw several people dragging a log the wrong way. He said the wood should be brought to the other house. The next second, one of the guys carrying the bar tripped over a rock lying on the ground. With surprise, the boy let go of the wood and nearly spat on the ground. Immediately, however, strong hands from behind caught him. The resident turned around to look at whoever had managed to pick him up. He saw the former corpse collector in front of him. Ark looked at the boy with a smile and told him to be more careful. Afterwards, the protagonist went to a standing hill and tree to reflect on what he had learned from the last battle. Leaning back against the trunk, Ark wondered what this ability called level transformation was. Armor of the Abyss immediately replied that due to this feature, the wearer could convert absorbed levels into new unique skills. In this world, unique skills have different effects. For example, increased speed and fire resistance are nice bonuses for adventurers. Normal adventurers can get them with low probability by gaining experience points and increasing their level. Previously, Ark could not gain experience points, and therefore could not have unique skills. But now, in exchange for gaining levels beyond the maximum, he could gain special unique skills. The boy wondered what kind of unique armor he had gotten after all. Suddenly, a panel of information popped up in front of the protagonist. In it, the armor recommended to first get a skill called Limit Breakthrough. It was a special skill that allowed you to gain unlimited levels. What particularly caught Ark's attention was that this skill had a price of 240 levels. Apparently, this was the number of points he should get. Then the protagonist thought that he now had 250 levels, in which case he would lose almost everything by acquiring this ability. But remembering the recent situation and the incident with the destroyed village, the guy decided that he critically needed this skill. Gathering his thoughts, he looked at the panel and decided to buy the ability. Armor said that to buy a skill, you have to say a code phrase and the name of the ability. The boy then clenched his fist and said that he was requesting to purchase a Limit Breakthrough. Armor announced the acceptance of the deal and began transforming levels. After that, a multitude of light rays began to flow out of the protagonist's body and swiftly drifted upwards. This incredible glow could be seen in the village itself. Many residents noticed a strange phenomenon occurring on a hill nearby. The crystal at the center of the abyss armor caused the wearer some pain. Ark held back from screaming, but at some point, everything stopped, and the armor announced that the transformation was complete and the Limit Breakthrough skill had been obtained. The protagonist lowered his head and looked at the panel that appeared. The notification duplicated the information about getting the new skillet. Suddenly, the guy's body started behaving strangely. Ark looked at his hands in bewilderment and thought that after that strange sensation, he felt as if his consciousness had expanded. Suddenly, the armor announced that the character could exceed the allowable level limit, meaning that he was now a creature superior to humans. The boy grinned afterward, surprised at such an unusual wording. Then he looked up at the sky and took a deep breath. Ark thought that not so long ago he had been an ordinary corpse collector. Having traveled such a long way, he was now practically a deity. At the same time, an unknown man came to the village. From the expression on his face, it was clear that he was extremely dissatisfied. He looked around the village in fury and muttered that he had come all this way for nothing. Then the stranger threw his huge sword off his shoulder and thrust it into the ground. As he looked around, he irritatedly realized that from the looks of the civilians, the monster had already been destroyed. His aura was overflowing with rage. The stranger thought he had only wasted his time. But immediately the stranger looked around, thinking it would be a good idea to find the adventurer who had defeated this demon. Suddenly, the protagonist on the hill was credited with an additional 200 levels. The armor announced that it was absorbing additional points that could not previously be granted to the wearer. The boy remembered where he had gotten those levels from. After defeating Cyclops, armor also announced that the takeover was impossible due to the limit. The protagonist was happy that although he had spent almost everything to increase his limit, but now he could still fight monsters safely. After examining the armor, Ark thought he should get his hands on as many unique skills as possible soon. With the help of these super valuable abilities, his fight against monsters will become even easier. And then he could surely become the greatest adventurer in the history of mankind. The boy wondered what he should do next. At the same moment, the boy did not notice someone creeping up behind him. Hearing a familiar voice, the protagonist turned around. The girl who came close to him called the guy by name. In the same second, Lyra happily pounced on Ark, nearly knocking the boy off his feet. The girl puffed up her cheeks and said that she had been looking for a boyfriend the whole time after the battle. She added that after yesterday's battle, the whole village was in chaos, and there was no way she could find Ark. The guy apologized to the girl, saying he was helping residents with firefighting yesterday. Suddenly, another voice from outside said that Lyra was very worried about the main character. It was Mill. She mouthed with a smile on her face that she was also worried about her savior. Ark added in a satisfied voice that he was glad the girls were okay. Lyra smiled and looked at the village protector, saying it was all thanks to him. The girl then added that she was very grateful to the main character for what he had done for her and for all the residents. She stepped closer, stood on her toes, and kissed the boy while noting that it was just a thank you. In the next second, Lyra stepped aside in embarrassment and looked at Ark. The adventurer, amazed at what had happened, stood and kept his eyes on the girl. Unexpectedly, Lyra turned to the protagonist, saying that she had been wanting to confess for a long time. Closing her eyes and bashfully bowing her head, she shouted to Ark that she loved him. A few seconds later, embarrassed by her own words, Lyra turned and ran towards the village. The main character opened his mouth in surprise and asked Mill, "What was that just now?" The girl regarded her savior with equal embarrassment, chuckling softly. Suddenly, behind the kid's back was his grandfather, who noted that it looked like spring had come to Ark this time too. The protagonist looked angrily at the satisfied faces of his friends, displeased that they made him feel embarrassed. With a wave of his hand, he told his companions to run away from this place. After the old man and Mill ran away, the main character held his hand over his face and exhaled heavily. Despite his outward resentment, inside, the boy shone brighter than the sun. He realized that he had never dreamed that someone would fall in love with him before, but now something had to be done about it. The armor mouthed that his recommendation was that the wearer should act like a man. The boy didn't expect even the armor to troll him and ordered the breastplate to shut up. A few days later, footsteps were heard on the road leading to the village. The squad leader, shielding his hand from the sun, surveyed the settlement spread out ahead of them. The green-haired adventurer noted that this place looked more like a wasteland. The gray-haired guy walking beside him said that this settlement was probably attacked by another monster. He then looked at the leader and said that if it was a fire dragon, there would be nothing left of the village in question. The squad leader agreed with his partner and said they should ask the locals about it anyway. The green-haired guy turned to the companions and said that they had to prevent this dragon from attacking at all costs. Waving his hand to the right, he ordered the squad to move out. After this command, the group, numbering several dozen adventurers, continued on their way. Meanwhile, the goblin cave was starting to have something going on. The vaults of the long corridors still held silence. However, sometime later, there was a grand awakening inside the cave. The dragon, which seemed to have been lying down and decomposing for a long time, suddenly woke up. At the same time, life in the village itself was going on as usual. There was no sign of trouble. Sitting in the tree crowns, the hunter hurled several daggers at the passing creatures. With a few accurate throws, he hit all the animals. After that, the creatures' muzzles began to turn blue, and they gradually weakened. The monsters would then synchronously fall to the ground, shivering in death convulsions. Ark took a closer look at his opponents and made sure he was hit. At that point, he was just a one-level adventurer. Jumping down from the branches, the guy rushed with great speed further into the forest. He had recently acquired many unique skills. One of these skills was the poisoned dagger skill, which cost as much as 200 levels. This skill allows you to apply deadly poison to your weapon and use it to deal with small monsters. The second ability was called Knife Thrower. With these major purchases, the protagonist lost all levels. But now he could deal with some monsters while avoiding direct skirmishes and melee combat. The only disadvantage of the poison was that one had to wait for a while before the monster would die. However, with these two useful abilities, Ark could quietly regain all of his former strength. While the protagonist was in the forest, bright beams of light would periodically come to him, announcing that another monster had died. After a few such runs, the young adventurer saw his level rise to 41. The lad thought that, given the rate at which he was accumulating these points, it would be worthwhile to use them to improve the skills he already had. With a wave of his hand, the protagonist used the request to purchase the poison enhancement. After that, an information panel appeared in front of Ark's face, indicating that his ability had been strengthened and his level was once again at 1. The satisfied boy thought that now the monsters would die even faster. Scratching his neck, he looked around and thought he'd had enough pumping for today. Ark figured that right now about 20 monsters in the forest should be poisoned by his knives, so in a couple hours he would be at level 200 again. Crunching his fingers, the boy thought that this day had also gone great, and it was finally time to head back to the village. However, after the boy reached the road, he saw a group of adventurers heading towards the village not far away. He caught up with the troop and asked why they were here and what had happened. The question of the unexpectedly curious stranger was heard by the squad leader. Turning around, he asked Ark, was the latter also an adventurer? It was Ein, the representative of the Adventurer Guild. He was currently at the 120th level. Without waiting for an answer, the squad leader ran up to the protagonist and opened the information panel to find out the guy's level. Immediately, however, his face expressed a peculiar disappointment. He looked at Ark and said that the level of the one so far was not high enough for their mission. Many of the squad members looked at the guy in surprise. Some of them thought he was just another newcomer. The boy had experienced this kind of reaction before, so it was no surprise to him. Ein tried to defuse the situation by saying that perhaps the boy wanted to be an adventurer. But Ark suddenly replied that he had been an adventurer for a long time. The guild representative was greatly surprised by this answer. Suddenly, the main character was approached by the deputy squad leader and asked why the guy was level 1 in that case. Ark looked calmly at the gray-haired guy. After that look, the adventurer suddenly turned pale and seemed to recognize the protagonist. He looked disdainfully at the boy and stepped aside, saying he knew him. Folding his hands on his shoulders, the deputy leader said that he had heard rumors of the weakest adventurer in history. Pointing his finger at Ark, he shouted that the famous corpse collector was in front of them. Suddenly, the boy replied that the bulky man was right in his speculation and asked if the man had any problems. The adventurer was taken aback by such insolence and was unable to say anything in response. Ark then turned to the leader of the group and repeated his question. Ain initially didn't answer anything. Despite such an oddity as the first level, he felt that there was a catch somewhere. After that, the green-haired man decided that there was no point in escalating the conflict and said that they had gotten an assignment in the guild to hunt. Ein reported that many special demons had recently been sighted in these lands. This was the first time the protagonist had heard of something like this and asked, "What kind of demons are these?" Ein replied that a black dragon, which was a powerful demon of the 150th level, had been discovered near the village in question. The band leader also added that no one can defeat such a monster alone. Waving his hands, he said that he had gathered a group of adventurers with special skills to kill this powerful creature. Ein smiled and said that they would defeat this monster with no problem and no one needed to worry about it. It was then that he realized he had forgotten to introduce himself. When he extended his hand, the guild representative called himself Ein. The protagonist accepted the handshake, saying his name was Ark. The boy thought to himself that he could handle a level 150 monster himself without difficulty. But what stressed him the most was the way the leader of the adventurer group described the creature. A memory of that huge dragon that lay in the goblin cave surfaced in the protagonist's mind. The next moment, a guy in armor ran into the crowd of adventurers, shouting loudly the name of the squad leader. Ein excitedly rushed to his subordinate, asking what had happened to him. The boy's face was twisted with horror. He tried to catch his breath before he said anything. Then the boy looked fearfully at the leader and said that the scouts had discovered the dragon. After the general shock passed, the guy described the whole situation. He and the scouts had come across a cave. Inside it, they found the very black dragon that had apparently only recently awakened. Ein listened to his subordinate's report and said that they were now heading there. The team leader then announced to those present that the scouts had located the target of the mission. Ein added that a difficult battle awaited them and ordered everyone to get ready. The adventurers standing around him shouted excitedly, raising their hands in the air. Only the protagonist understood the danger of the situation. The level of the entire group was at about 120 points. From the experience of previous battles, Ark realized that even though many members of the group had unique skills, they would have a tough time fighting a dragon with 150 levels. Guy looked around at the enthusiastic adventurers again and realized that he couldn't just leave them. Without much hope, the boy turned to Ein and asked him to take him along. Ark thought to himself that the monsters he had poisoned should die soon, and then he would get level 200. In that case, there shouldn't be any problems with the dragon. However, Ein unexpectedly rejected the protagonist's suggestions. The leader of the group looked menacingly at the guy and said that he didn't realize the gravity of the situation and it would be very dangerous for him. After such a harsh rejection, Ark tried to object, but immediately he felt the invisible pressure of the entire squad bearing down on him. The boy clearly heard various chuckles and mocking questions. All the adventurers thought that a guy with a first level was definitely not going to help them. Suddenly, a bulky man with white hair approached Ark. He looked disdainfully at the corpse collector and noted that their leader had treated him somewhat gently. The adventurer then shouted out that in the opinion of most, the boy was a weakling. With that, the group turned around and walked off in the direction of the cave, leaving Ark to himself. Only the protagonist realized that at this rate, they would all die there. But immediately, the guy thought that with his current level, there really wasn't much he could do to help there. Ark realized he didn't have an election. Taking one last look at the departing adventurers, he decided that he should just wait for the levels to arrive and then catch up with them. A short while later, the group reached the cave. Ein, who had opened the information panel, was trembling and couldn't come to his senses. This was definitely not something they had been warned about. The guild representative looked at the monster in horror and couldn't believe that it was a 150th level dragon. The boy was horrified, thinking that the clerk's office had just played a joke on them. This was definitely not the black dragon they had expected to see. In front of them was a calamity rank monster that possessed an incredible 300th level. Previously, Ain had only heard of these infernal monsters from ancient books. It was the Black Dragon Emperor, nicknamed the Destroyer of Worlds. The group leader stared in horror at the creature before them. It had already easily killed all the scouts who had come earlier. Ain shouted the order to retreat in panic. There was no way they could handle this monster under any circumstances. Trying to gather his thoughts, the boy shouted for someone to request help from the guild. However, Ein then looked up and saw something approaching him. The leader of the group didn't have time to block the blow, and the dragon knocked the green-haired man to the ground with a sweep of its tail. Meanwhile, the protagonist gradually ran up to the cave. From afar, he heard the sounds of battle and realized that he was a little late. In the distance, in an open field, Ark saw the very dragon from the goblin cave. Horrified, the boy thought, was it really just pretend when he pulled the creature out of his body and into his armor? Then Ark thought it was just unnecessary thoughts and he needed to speed up. Suddenly, the dragon raised its jaws and began preparing a huge energy shot. The hero asked how long before he could get all his levels. Armor replied that the accrual would happen within 30 seconds. Running closer to the battlefield, Ark could already see the consequences that this dragon had arranged. Most of the adventurers had already been killed, and only the strongest remained alive to meet their deaths in helplessness. The boy clenched his teeth and tried to run as fast as he could. At the same time, he heard some strange sounds from behind him. When he looked behind him, he saw several beams flying towards him. It was those long-awaited levels from the monsters he had killed. Armor announced the confirmation of the monsters' deaths from poison and level absorption. The hero's new level was now 201. The guy shouted furiously to the armor that he was sending a purchase request. Staring into the dragon's wide-open maw, Ark decided to acquire the fire resistance ability. The next instant, the monster let down a huge pillar of purple flame. The protagonist ran right into this energy stream and stopped it with his hand. In passing, he surveyed the battlefield for survivors. Ark looked around and saw Ein lying on the ground, staring in horror at what had happened. The boy thought that the guild representative was the only survivor. The green-haired boy looked at the first-level weakling in horror and didn't understand how he had stopped the World Destroyer's attack. Suddenly, the deputy leader barely got to his feet and asked why some corpse collector wasn't even injured and they were barely standing on their feet. The protagonist hesitated to answer, not knowing what to say to avoid being discovered. Suddenly, Ark shouted that it was all because he was stronger than all of them. But then the guy frustratedly clenched his fist and muttered that even with such incredible strength, he was unable to save everyone. After that, the gray-haired man looked into the eyes of the weakling with distrust. Then, without uttering a word, he let out his last breath and dropped dead. The sight of a man killed by his stupidity finally undermined the protagonist's self-control. Ark's eyes flashed with rage, and he glared in the dragon's direction. The guy moved towards the destroyer of worlds. Pulling his sword from behind his back, the protagonist muttered that no matter how he became, there was no way he could save people. Amplifying his aura to an incredible scale, the boy shouted to the destroyer of worlds that he would defeat him right here and now. In response, the monster looked at the guy and roared furiously. The next moment, the monster released an energy ball towards the protagonist. Ain shouted in horror to Ark to get out of there immediately. However, the boy turned around and calmly told the adventurer leader not to worry about him. The impulse was approaching the guy with great speed, but he did not move from his seat. Ark then straightened his arm and smashed the violet energy ball with a single blow. Just then, the lad confidently muttered that such a weak flame could not hurt him under any circumstances. Ain stared at the corpse collector in incomprehension. He didn't understand how a first-level adventurer could calmly fend off the blows of such a powerful monster. It seemed that the destroyer of worlds was also puzzled by such audacity from his opponent. The demon screamed furiously, emitting several powerful pulses from itself at the same time. However, each of these strikes were calmly parried and knocked aside by Ark. The guy realized that thanks to his new ability, the creature's fire attacks no longer worked. He had to spend most of his levels to gain fire resistance. Now Ark could fight back safely, but he was only level 21. But parrying blows alone was not enough to win. The boy had to think of a way to defeat this dragon, but in order to do that, you had to raise yourself up somehow. Suddenly, the destroyer of worlds approached Ark and swung his claws. The boy dodged the first blow with great difficulty, and the creature's paw flew within a few centimeters of him. The boy looked at the demon in horror. Apparently, the demon guessed that his fire did not harm the enemy, and then he decided to use physical attacks. Ark realized that he would not be able to withstand the attacks of a destroyer of worlds that was on a whole other level. But suddenly, the boy felt a strange aura enhancement not far from the battlefield. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something incredibly fast fly past him in the creature's direction. This unknown person was on a completely different level. At the same second, the protagonist heard the unknown person tell the dragon that the dragon had disappointed him. At the same second, something lightning fast swept past the monster, slicing through the demon's neck. The dragon's head immediately soared upwards, spraying blood all over the battlefield. After that, the remains of the majestic monster collapsed not far from Ark, who didn't understand how this even happened. Suddenly, an unknown person who was surely one of the adventurers landed on the monster's backbone. The protagonist stared at the stranger in surprise, marveling that he had killed the destroyer of worlds with a single blow. Surprised by such a performance, the boy asked the adventurer who he was. The man grinned and repeated Ark's question with a smile on his face. He spread his arms out to the sides and mouthed his name as Baldar. The man then muttered that he was the only calamity rank adventurer in the entire continent. Ark was dumbfounded by what he heard. He had never known of such a rank among humans before. Ian, who had risen to his feet, held up his hand and muttered that he had never personally seen the man, but had heard much about him. According to the guy, this possessor of incredible strength is the one that legends are made of. This type is the one who stands head and shoulders above all the adventurers in the world. No one will ever reach the same level. That's what the legends say the cancer rank disaster means. Baldar slung his sword behind his back and noted that Ein was quite well aware of him. The protagonist, meanwhile, opened the information panel with interest to learn more about the man across the room. And indeed, judging from the stats, Baldar was conventionally higher than any human. After all, he had an incredible 300th level and the unique skill of limit breakthrough. The armor confirmed that this man had this kind of ability from birth. Ark realized that this was the exact opposite of his zero experience skill. Then the hero asked Baldar if he had really come to help them. The adventurer grinned in response and repeated the boy's question ironically. He settled on the dragon's neck and mouthed what sounded like utter nonsense. Baldar then turned to the adventurer in black armor and said that because of the boy, all his plans were ruined. Ark asked in bewilderment what such plans his interlocutor was talking about. The big man replied with a smile that the boy must surely have heard about the rumors that were going around the village about him. Many residents refer to the guy as the hero in black armor, who single-handedly defeated the demon. Baldar said he wondered if the rumors were true. However, the guy completely disappointed him. At this moment, the dragon's eyes suddenly opened. The creature tried with its last strength to move its severed head, but Baldar drew his sword again and plunged it into the monster's skull, shouting for it to shut up. The creature's muscles stopped contracting and its head sank to the ground. The adventurer then touched the dragon's horns again and said that he had one interesting fact about the creature. The destroyer of worlds will regenerate until it destroys its magical core. Afterward, Baldar said that he had killed this monster once before in a cave with goblins. Ark was completely shocked by this information. Afterward, the adventurer said that he purposely didn't break the core and left the monster to die in this cave. The main character couldn't believe that this psycho had done something like this. In the next second, however, the realization came into his head as to why Baldar had done such a thing. At that moment, Baldar seemed to read Ark's mind and said that he had seen the cyclops eating the flesh of a dragon that had not yet died. He explained that the monster that had eaten the creature's flesh had evolved very quickly and had become more ferocious. The strange type then explained that in its true form, the destroyer of worlds was too powerful and would not leave a trace of the village. So he needed a weaker monster to carry out his plan, and the cyclops was perfect for the task. Baldar noted at the same time that his actions must be very questionable. That's when the psycho laughed and said he was going to tell me everything. First, he wanted to attack the monster in the village and then kill it, making himself look like a hero. Second, reawakening the destroyer of worlds would allow him to be killed again and become stronger in the process. As a result, Baldar would gain boundless power and become world famous in the process. Ein stared in horror at the distraught adventurer and tried to ask the man what he meant. However, the psycho didn't let the guy speak and looked towards Ark. Pointing his finger at the protagonist, he shouted that some bastard in black armor had ruined all his plans. But at the same time, Ark sighed heavily and said he was surprised at this turn of events. He asked his interlocutor if he was really so petty that he had decided to sell the lives of dozens of residents for some petty thing like fame. Baldar replied to Ark that he was an idiot and explained that a great hero like him needs everything, from money and fame to women. He looked at the guy with crazy eyes and said that everything one needed in this life could be achieved with such immense power. A moment later, however, the protagonist called his interlocutor a fool without a shadow of a doubt. Baldar looked back at the boy with a puzzled look. Everything was boiling inside Ark. At that moment, he wanted to tear that psychopath to pieces. He called Baldar a real idiot, saying that he was completely indifferent to the fate of random people for the sake of his stupid desires. The boy said that because of some upstart's whim, the lives of the villagers had been jeopardized and many good adventurers had been killed. Ark asked his interlocutor if he had thought about these factors even for a second. Receiving no response, the boy drew his sword and asked the armor of the abyss to lend all of his power. Glaring furiously at his opponent, the guy shouted that it was time to bring one arrogant prick down to earth. After watching this strange attempt at self-expression, Baldar grinned, asking if some brat wanted to teach him a lesson. He then looked at the protagonist with hatred in his eyes and said that a lowlife like him shouldn't overestimate himself. In the same second, the madman's aura intensified several times and unleashed a bright stream of energy. From the power of the vortex created, both adventurers could barely stay on their feet. Ark thought to himself that he hadn't expected less strength from a level 300 man. The boy realized that if they started fighting now, he wouldn't stand a chance. Nevertheless, he did not budge, having only level 21. But at the same second, the main character's attention was drawn to an object behind his opponent's back. The dragon's huge carcass was still lying there without moving. However, the crystal in the center of its neck was not broken. The fire of life still blazed within him, and that meant that the dragon was not completely slain. Ark realized that he could use this situation to his advantage. The core is still very much vulnerable. If, in the heat of battle, he managed to reach and break the crystal, the armor would be able to absorb all 300 levels of the World Destroyer. Trying to think through the next course of action, the protagonist asked the armor if there was a skill for ranged attacks that he could acquire now. A low voice answered that there were a few seconds left to complete the search. At the same moment, Ark raised his head when he heard Baldar call out to him. The madman attacked the guy almost without delay, swinging his sword in a leap. You even Baldar shouted frantically that it was too late to beg for mercy. The boy realized he was an idiot for letting his opponent get so close at the start of the fight. In the next instant, the heaviest blow of the sword struck the ground in front of Ark and Ein. A torrent of fire rained down on both adventurers, knocking them to the ground. Unable to stay on his feet, the protagonist flew off to the side, somersaulting and trying not to collapse. A short while later, the guy fell to the ground. The entire field around him was scorched in a huge radius after that attack. Bloodstains appeared on Ark's forehead. It was then that he marveled at this incredible power. The lad thought that such phenomena were indeed worthy of the rank of calamity. Baldar looked contentedly at his defeated opponent and wondered if he had just lost his mind. He then looked fiercely into the eyes of the protagonist and said that this was the end. The madman headed towards Ark, who was struggling to get to his feet. When he saw it, he thought that if he continued like this, he would definitely be finished. At this point, the armor said that the quest was complete and recommended acquiring the small grenade skill. This ability gives the weapon a small explosive power and costs 20 levels. The protagonist looked at this suggestion in bewilderment and didn't understand how it could help him. He said he couldn't destroy the core if he tried to detonate his sword. However, the armor replied that it would not be necessary. Ark looked around again and saw that the enemy was quite close. He asked the armor again what was required of him. In response, a low voice recommended the use of poisoned knives to raise the level. The protagonist rose to his feet with great difficulty, asking if this was really all that could help him. Baldar looked over his opponent, who was still fighting for his life, and asked why he was trying to get up. Receiving no reply, he shouted that the boy could do nothing, for even to stand on his feet he could manage with great difficulty. In response, Ark only quietly sent a request to acquire the small grenades ability. A second later, the crystal in the center of his chest glowed brightly. The bully looked at what was happening in bewilderment. He had never seen anything like this before, so he asked the boy what he was doing. Immediately, the protagonist extended his arm to the side. 3 sharp daggers glowed between his fingers. Then he looked at his opponent with hatred. There was no despair or panic in his eyes. Suddenly, Ark swung his arm and threw all 3 knives at Baldar, shouting that everything was about to change. It was not the first time the adventurer had encountered this ability. He realized at once that they were the most common poison daggers. At the same second, Baldar swung his sword. There was a clang of metal, signaling that he had repulsed the attack. The psycho looked at his desperate opponent in bewilderment and asked why he was playing with him, some childish game. He asked the brat angrily, what was the point if those knives didn't reach their target? Suddenly, Ark replied that he realized that none of the daggers had harmed Baldar. But then he replied with a faint smile that he hadn't originally been aiming for the adventurer. After that, the protagonist saw something shining brightly in the dragon's core. This meant that his attack had reached its target after all. Realizing the horror of what had happened, Baldar turned around and saw a blade sticking out of the brightly glowing crystal. Ark shouted afterward, ordering the weapon to explode. A bright flash followed by a shockwave blew the dragon's core into small pieces. The boy looked contentedly at the startled creature, pleased that his plan had worked. Now the destroyer of worlds has finally come to an end. After that, dozens of bright streams of energy rushed out from the body of the defeated dragon directly towards the protagonist. Balmer stared at this apparition, stunned for the first time encountering something like this. After that, a low voice coming from the direction of the arch said that the owner's level had been raised. Hearing this, the big guy looked at his opponent in bewilderment. Judging from the brat's appearance, his aura had transformed to a great extent. At the same second, he suddenly lunged at the adventurer. The guy's speed instantly increased to the point where his movements were hard to track. Baldar had barely had time to regain his senses before Ark was upon him with his first attack, which the psycho barely had time to block. The adventurer tried to figure out what had happened to the bastard and why he had become so strong. The big man asked his opponent how he could do such things with only level 21. Ark replied that he had indeed been weak until a while ago, but that things had changed now. In that very second, his aura increased in strength, dispelling all of Baldar's energy with its power. The boy looked triumphantly into the eyes of the maddened adventurer and said that he was level 301. Judging by the thug's face, he was starting to panic a bit. Gradually, the initiative began to pass to the opponent. Just then, he looked at Ark in exasperation and said that he seemed to have figured it out. Waving off the annoying brat, Baldar added that he wondered how the guy was going to defeat this monster. And it all happened because of some damn ability. Such brazen theft of his loot by some bastard had driven the thug into a state of complete insanity. He forcefully pounced on Ark again, who, despite his increased level, still couldn't get used to his opponent's speed. After another powerful blow, the main character's body flew back again. Baldar looked at Ark madly and said he shouldn't joke with him like that. The boy rose from the ground, but this time the movements were much easier for him. The madman then added that he didn't see any problem with it, as the guy was only 1 level higher. While the protagonist was trying to regain consciousness, the big guy asked, did he really think he could handle a madness rank adventurer with vast combat experience? Then he shouted that he still thought the outcome of the fight was a foregone conclusion and pounced again on Ark, who barely had time to get to his feet. However, this powerful attack suddenly hit the wrong target. The protagonist managed to dodge it by jumping aside. Baldar looked confusedly in the direction the boy had dodged, not realizing how he hadn't had time, hadn't been able to keep up with the brat. But by that point, Ark's look was completely different. He deftly maneuvered in the air and counterattacked, attacking his opponent from behind. Baldar, sensing danger, barely had time to block the approaching blow. With each new active phase of the fight, the ground around them shook more and more violently. The protagonist kept stepping more and more on his opponent. He shouted that he didn't care about any of Baldar's experience. Ark launched attack after attack, not intending to give his opponent any respite. By this point, the big guy wasn't fighting at all and was just trying to dodge more and more blows. It was the first time in his career as an adventurer of the rank of madness that Baldar had faced such an opponent. It was then that the boy shouted that there was no way he would lose to such a bastard. But no sooner had Ark launched another attack than the big guy instantly changed his aura, throwing a huge amount of energy into the air. For now, the fighting stopped for a while. The madman said the boy's armor was pretty good, but then the bulky man added that he was sick of the guy talking nonsense here. The upstart then looked at the protagonist's face with hatred in his eyes and said that this one better shut up. Then Baldar activated the Blood God manifestation skill. The entire sky around him was immediately blinded by an incredible flash. In the next instant, a huge beam of energy pierced into the big guy's body from the clouds. The madman's armor and body began to emit a completely different aura. It was also amazing that a mere human body could contain such a huge surge of energy. Ark covered himself with his hand against the rush of air. He'd never heard of anything like this before, and it was confusing him. Before the protagonist could even realize it, his opponent immediately delivered a sharp, slashing blow to his side. Baldar kept shouting and repeating the word force. The big guy wouldn't stop, saying that now the brat would see his true power. The frightened Ark dodged the big man's relentless attacks time after time with great difficulty. At the same time, the mad adventurer was getting closer and closer to the protagonist, shouting that he had nowhere to run. Looking at these massive attacks, the boy realized that if he couldn't dodge, he would definitely be finished. He had to keep maneuvering between these blows, contemplating how to deal with the problem that had appeared. In that second, Ark realized that this was most likely the same skill he had encountered in the purchase panel. It was a unique ability that could only be used once, and it greatly increased the level of the wielder. With that thought, the boy scurried off to the side, realizing that he would need some time to implement the plan that had appeared to him. At that time, he also tried to give the armor a command to acquire the skill. However, Baldar, who heard this, instantly attacked the protagonist, adding that there was nothing the guy could do anymore. Ark had to retreat even more. If the big man continued to attack him, the plan might not work. But the moment the madman tried to attack once again, a familiar figure swept past the protagonist. Ark saw Baldar's hardest blow deflected by Ein's shield. The difference in levels, however, was too high, and in the next instant, the green-haired adventurer's body was thrown back. The boy fell to the ground far to the side, writhing in pain. Then he rolled over from his back, and resting his hand on the wet ground, turned to Ark. In a trembling voice, Ain said that if that bastard had dealt with the dragon originally, all of his friends would be alive right now. Immediately, the boy raised his tearful eyes and asked the protagonist to avenge the adventurers killed in battle. Disappointed by this scene, Ark looked at Baldar with hatred and replied to his partner that he would definitely do it. The boy then waved his hand to the side and sent a request to acquire the Black Armor Curse ability. The madman who heard this once again tried to attack the protagonist with a powerful slashing blow. Armor warned Ark that this skill could only be used once. Seconds before the powerful energy stream reached the protagonist's body, a low voice asked if the host would confirm the acquisition request. The boy immediately shouted that he agreed with everything, and the armor approved the request. The voice also added that the cost of a skill varies from 1 to infinity. Thus, it is possible to pay extra with any number of levels. Holding back the oncoming energy storm, the protagonist shouted out that he wanted to add points. He said he wanted to add 299 levels so that the total acquisition cost would be 300. The armor responded by successfully accepting the request and acquired the skill. At the same moment, 300 energy beams merged into one large glowing pillar pointing towards the heavens. In response, a huge beam of sparkling light shot out from the clouds of the ark. Ein watched in horror, trying to figure out what had happened to his comrade. The moment the flow of energy gradually began to dissipate, A boy appeared in front of the green-haired adventurer's face. It seemed his body could barely contain the incoming force. Now Ark possessed the first level again. He bet everything he had on this risky move. A surprised Baldar turned to the bastard and asked what he had just done. Not waiting for a response, the bulky man decided to check the boy's status to see if anything had changed. Suddenly, the madman saw something that made him laugh. He suddenly realized that the brat was somehow once again a first-level weakling. Confident of his unqualified victory, Baldar shouted that now the guy was definitely finished. He then called his opponent a complete idiot and pounced on him, shouting that it was time for him to die. Ark looked indifferently at the crazed adventurer and turned to him. The protagonist told the big man that he would never beat him. After that, the guy activated the purchased ability. The aura around him instantly turned a dark purple color. Baldar immediately stopped and looked at his opponent in confusion. The boy looked completely different from the person who had recently gotten a measly first level. Ark stretched out his hand and lightly squeezed his fingers, making it look like he was grabbing something. At the same instant, streams of dark matter rushed toward the stunned Baldar. The madman stood stiffly, unable to move. At the same instant, an unknown ability gripped him tightly by the throat. After the initial shock, the madman felt himself begin to lose his strength. He felt matter begin to flow through his veins and squeeze him like an apple. Seeing Baldar floundering helplessly, Ark said it was the curse of the black armor. The essence of this ability is to absorb the opponent's level in proportion to the points spent. The weakening thug glanced fearfully at the guy, trying to comprehend what he had just said. The protagonist added that he had spent 299 levels. Accordingly, Baldar would lose the same amount. Ark then ironically asked his helpless opponent what level he thought he would end up with. The crazy adventurer asked the guy confusedly, was the guy really kidding him like that? Then, when there was no response, the bully had a panic attack. He became hysterical and screamed for the brat to let him go immediately. The protagonist smiled and said that his plan was originally quite simple. Now, once the ability is complete, they will both only be level 1. Then Baldar threw back his head and shouted. Now, all his years of labor had been spoiled by one fight. Soon, the dark matter gradually began to recede, then calmly landed on the ground. He gritted his teeth, still unable to believe what was happening. The psycho said it was simply impossible. The adventurer then glared furiously at his opponent and shouted that this was utter nonsense. Out of a last hope, he opened the information panel to see if there had been any changes. In the next second, Baldar's horror was unbounded. As of now, he really only had a paltry first level. The big guy saw the protagonist smile. He said he wasn't going to let any bastard sneer at him, and especially not the one who stole all the levels from him. Baldar looked menacingly at Ark and said that he was still a calamity rank adventurer. The article madman confidently said that even having a level 1, he could easily crush the boy. But as soon as the thug uttered this, the protagonist ran up and delivered a slashing blow to his opponent. Before Baldar even had a chance to realize it, blood immediately spurted from his mouth. Ark told his defeated opponent that recently there was a man in the village of Rakuru who was called the Corpse Collector. The guy then began to deliver blow after blow while telling a story. He said that because of his skill, the Corpse Collector could not gain experience and could not level up. The madman dodged several blows and drew his sword and looked tiredly at the boy. The bulky man then ordered the brat to shut up in a rage and swung his sword. In the next second, he struck the ground, intending to once again create an energy wave to knock his opponent down. However, due to the weakening, Baldar no longer had this opportunity. Watching this death agony, Ark continued the story by saying that this gathering of corpses had only level 1. The protagonist then stood up to his full height and swung his sword once more. In the next instant, he attacked the mad adventurer, cutting off his arm. Ark said that the Corpse Collector was now invincible. After looking over his defeated opponent, the boy said that after all he had been through, he knew best how to survive on the first level. Baldar's eyes gradually began to darken. He frantically examined his hand, which was lying on the ground in the pouring rain. Blood began to gush from his body. The bully gradually began to lose the last of his strength. With rage and consternation, he turned around and glared at the brat, calling him a fucking bastard. Baldar then tried to raise his huge sword in his only remaining hand. Leaning on his weapon, the madman said it wasn't over yet. Ark glanced behind him disdainfully, saying that it was already clear to everyone who had won. But suddenly, the wounded adventurer bounced off the ground and pounced on his opponent. He was bleeding, screaming unintelligibly, and staring hatefully at the strange type. Hearing this, the protagonist said that it seems that Baldar has stopped being sober about the situation. With incredible speed, the guy turned around and lightning-fast repelled the thug's desperate attack. The madman's sword flew aside with a clang, and Ark said it was already over. In the next instant, he swiftly threw a multitude of punches at his opponent's body. Baldar, choking on his own blood, could do nothing about it. Yet his eyes still glowed with hatred before he died. A second later, the madman's body fell to the ground, and he stopped moving. Only then did Baldar's weapon, which had flown aside with a clang, slammed into the ground. This wounded Ein was finally able to get closer to his savior. The green-haired adventurer grabbed Ark's hand and thanked the boy for being able to avenge all his comrades. The protagonist replied that he shouldn't be thanked, because even without Ain's request, he wouldn't have been able to forgive the bastard and would have defeated him anyway. Suddenly, a sound from behind made the boy look around. He heard a slight stirring coming from the side of Baldar's body. The big man didn't seem to want to accept defeat. Suddenly, the madman shouted out, calling out to the Black Knight. Baldar said the bastard cut off his right arm and cornered himself with it. Psycho said that he would hate to do it, but it would soon be known to other adventurers with the rank of insanity. Bleeding, Baldar said that if he stopped showing any activity, everyone would find it suspicious, and they would immediately look for him. Lifting the ground, he said, "These annoyances are always very curious." Grasping the spot where the severed arm used to be, Baldar said that his friends would be curious as to who had defeated him, and they would begin hunting the boy. With a furious look at his assassin, the bulky man said that the Black Knight would definitely come to an end. After hearing all of this, Ark said he didn't care if anyone else could challenge him. Guy added that he would definitely fight in such a case. Baldar said that in that case the boy should pray that he would not waste all his strength for nothing. At that moment, the bracelet on the adventurer's arm glowed. It was then that he thought he had already lost too much blood. After a while, the light from the amulet began to intensify. The exhausted Baldar told the Black Knight that they would see each other again. Ein immediately realized what was up and shouted to Ark that the bastard wanted to teleport. The protagonist grabbed his weapon, shouting that at this rate he would just run away and needed to be stopped sooner rather than later. Lastly, Baldar muttered that he would make the Black Knight regret not finishing him off at once, and asked him to memorize those words. After that, a bright pillar of scarlet flame enveloped the adventurer's defenseless body. Then Baldar disappeared and the energy flowed into the sky. He thought, annoyed, that next time he would kill him for sure. Turning back to Ein, the protagonist said he was a little short on time. The terrified adventurer said it was just awful, for Baldar would surely come back for them with reinforcements. After Ein's question about what they should do next, Ark replied that they would be fine, but right now it was advisable for them to get out of here as soon as possible. Then the boy suddenly smiled and said that even if Baldar got in his way once more, he would definitely defeat this madman. Ein, who had calmed down after those words, told Ark that he relied on him a lot. Also, the main character said that what's more important now is that they lost so many people in this battle. The leader of the once large unit looked fearfully at the field and gulped, saying he needed to report casualties. Suddenly, Ark turned to Ein in a mysterious voice. After asking the adventurer what happened, the protagonist said that he had one request and asked his interlocutor to listen to him. On the way to the village, Ark told his partner everything he thought. The green-haired man asked him if he was sure. The boy said without hesitation that he had made up his mind long ago. After that, Ein looked at his companion with a satisfied look and smiled. After a while, both boys reached the settlement safely. Ark looked around the familiar neighborhoods with a smile and was glad they were finally back. At this point, Ein distracted his interlocutor by saying that when the boy had asked him for a favor, he had not expected such a request from such a strong adventurer. The green-haired man said it was a surprise to him when Ark asked him to bring him to another city. The protagonist agreed, saying that he still wants to remain the protector of his home village and help the people here. And now he had attracted the attention of adventurers of the rank of madness. If Ark stays here, Baldar's adventurers will find him sooner or later anyway. In this case, the villagers will be in great danger, and the boy wants to protect them from such a threat with all his might. Ein said that he understood his interlocutor perfectly well, so he listened to his request to the end. The adventurer then took out a glowing amulet from his pocket and said that he had already notified the Guild of the Losses, and Ark using the magical communicator. Guy explained to the organization the situation going on, and several adventurers had been sent to the village for protection, so it would be safe for a while. The protagonist thanked Ein sincerely, and the latter smiled back. What both boys didn't know at the time was that all this time Mill had been following them through the streets, eavesdropping on the conversation. At one of the alleys, the girl hastily turned around and ran in the opposite direction. Upon reaching the market rows, Ark was surprised to see that the shop where his grandfather worked was closed today. The protagonist thought it was probably because it was a day off. Ein wondered with interest if the person he was talking to wanted to see someone. The guy said that he could quietly make arrangements and change the day of departure. Ark, however, shook his head. The boy said they had better go, for if he saw his loved ones, their parting would be painful. The protagonist thought to himself that it wasn't just Grandpa. He also didn't want to say goodbye to Mill and Lyra. Leaving the village, the lad reasoned that he would not forgive himself if people dear to him were hurt just because they got involved with someone like him. With this thought, the travelers reached the stone archway dividing the village boundary. Ein turned to his companion, saying that if he left this place, he would not be able to return here soon. Then he asked Ark if he would regret that decision. The boy made a serious face and answered in the negative without a second thought. Then he adjusted the sack on his shoulder with his hand and advanced. But no sooner had the protagonist set off for a new life than a familiar voice called out to him from behind. It was his grandfather, holding a package in his hands. The boy turned around and the old man asked his grandson why he had a sad expression on his face. Hearing no reply, the merchant held out his hand with the packet to Ark, saying that he happened to know that the lad was going on a trip. For such an occasion, Grandpa specially decided to bake bread for the road. The protagonist took the package, apologizing to the old man for deciding to leave the village so abruptly. Seeing that the boy was tense and upset, the old man said that he should just smile. He also added that if Ark did decide to leave their village, then there must be a good reason. The merchant said the boy is called an adventurer for a reason. Grandfather muttered that he had been watching Ark's formation for a long time, and now he wanted to see the boy with a smile on his face as a farewell. These words made the protagonist very sad and only brought on a new sadness. However, Ark still gathered his thoughts and gave one last smile. He waved goodbye to his grandfather, telling him it was time for him to move out. Afterward, the companions set out on the road in high spirits. Ein noted with a smile that this old man seemed to be a very nice person. On the road, Ark opened the bag and looked at the loaf with some nostalgia. Then he pushed away the sad memories and took a bite of bread. Ein looked at his companion and asked what the farewell bread tasted like. The protagonist replied with a smile on his face that it was incredibly delicious. The green-haired adventurer replied that was fine. He also added that they would first look into the city where the guild he worked for was located. Their path lay to the sand-covered southern headquarters of the Adventurers Guild, the city of Durham. The moment the companions had already moved far away from the village, Mill found Lyra after all. Only then did she manage to convey this unexpected news. Lyra was shocked and upset that the man she liked had left the village without even saying goodbye to her. Sometime later, when the travelers crossed one of the next hills, they saw a strange sight. A group of goblins attacked a wagon standing on the road. The levels of these monsters ranged from 1st to 5th. Ian shouted that this was what a caravan of traveling traders usually looked like. At the same time, Ark asked his partner to support his stuff for literally 1 minute. The guy immediately unsheathed his sword, saying that it would be a good idea for him to level up before arriving in the city. In the next second, he decapitated half of the goblins on the road with a few deft moves. The leader of the group of monsters, who possessed level 5, pounced on Ark from behind. However, the boy had no problem parrying this attack. He then swung his sword again and killed several more monsters with a single blow. Already accustomed to such a spectacle, Ein watched the beating with interest. Mentally, he thought about how he couldn't wait for the moment when Ark would finally show all of his true power. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued to take down opponents without difficulty. After the last level absorption, the boy looked around and, seeing no more monsters, realized that this battle had been a success. Now they needed to get to Durham if possible without any unnecessary stops. A while later, the heroine reached the city. Passing through the main gate, the adventurers immediately found themselves in one of the busy streets. Ian said they had finally arrived. Ark looked at the exotic buildings with interest. The companion turned around and told his partner that this was the very southern town of Durham. This fortress was located northeast of the village of Rakura. Durham is one of the largest cities in the southern part of the continent. Upon entering, Ark immediately noted that it was very crowded and the atmosphere was drastically different from the village. Ein grinned and said it was not surprising, for Durham was one of the most traveled cities. He also pointed to the spire of a tall tower, saying that this was the location of the headquarters. Ein added that the full name of the organization was the Southern Branch of the Adventurers Guild Central Council. The green-haired man enlightened his companion, saying that there were many headquarters on the continent. There are many talented adventurers in all of them. Ein explained that specifically in this ward, there are also a lot of unusual guys similar to Ark. Unexpectedly, the companions said that the protagonist would not have to stand out much against their background, unless, of course, he upgraded his level again. The boy smiled at Ein. At the moment, he had 110th level. Ark then turned to his companion and thanked him for his advice. The fact is that on the way to Durham, the traveler stopped several more times for the protagonist to increase his level. At one point, Ein said that it was not worth it to level up unnecessarily. These words surprised Ark, and he asked why that was so. The companion said that if the guy's level was very different from others, it would attract undue attention. Ein asked Ark to imagine a situation where he would walk under Durham, having a level 300, for example. The people around him would immediately start saying that he was an adventurer of the madness rank. When word spreads through the city, Baldar's bloodhounds will surely know of the unknown hero's appearance. Besides, if the other adventurers found out that Ark was the type who had defeated their comrade, they would surely want to match strength with him, leading to more destruction. Furthermore, Ein explained that it was rumored that there were a bunch of weirdos among people like Baldar, so it was best not to attract the attention of strange individuals. Suddenly, the green-haired man turned around and looked sideways behind him. Between the rocks, he saw a rabbit shaking with fear. Ein tried to summon the frightened animal, telling his partner that the adventurers should stick together rather than measure their strength. The rabbit looked incredulously in the man's direction and did not react at first. However, he then took a few timid steps toward Ein. The very next second, the animal jumped into the green-haired man's arms. The boy said that adventurers should keep the peace of peaceful citizens and protect them. Remembering this situation, Ark looked at his companion and thought that he was very talented. Most adventurers who have achieved serious success are only interested in money and fame, and so was Baldar. Ark smiled and thought he wished he could be as kind and fair as Ein. However, something the boy disagreed with. Just because he has a high level doesn't mean anything. An adventurer must match his power and use it wisely. Afterward, the protagonist asked his guide where they were going now. Ein immediately remembered this and apologized for the fact that they had been chatting, and he hadn't told them about the plans at all. First, they need to report the Destroyer of Worlds, so first they need to go to the guild headquarters. After saying that, Ein became very sad and seriously thought about something. The protagonist noticed this sudden change of mood. Most likely, his companion remembered his dead friends for the first time in a long time. The rest of the way was passed in complete silence. Soon the companions reached a high tower. Inside, Ein and Ark had to wait in line at the reception area. Soon it was their turn. A pleasant-looking girl said hello to the adventurers and asked what order they wanted to report. Ein said he relayed everything in the communicator report. The girl said that in that case, she would now give out the reward. She then asked with a smile to say the name of the mission accomplished. I sullenly muttered that they had resolved the incident in Rakura village. The monster's name was World Destroyer. After these words, the reception room fell silent. The girl behind the counter looked at the visitors with surprise and some consternation. Ark was stunned at the sudden silence and thought that surely this was unusual for them. After that, the girl abruptly turned around and started frantically digging somewhere, saying that she would now present the award. Then she turned around and put the Pepper Hero's 4 purses up to the top stuffed with gold coins. Ein stared at the award silently, not uttering a word. Suddenly, the girl said that the report she received said that the rest of the squad had died during the mission. Therefore, the entire reward for slaying the dragon goes to the sole survivor, that is Mr. Ein. After that, the girl looked away confusedly, not knowing what else to say. In that same second, the realization came to Ark as to why his partner had been slumped the entire way. Ein feels great guilt for being the sole survivor of the massacre. Now these nightmares will torment him. After that, the adventurer took the money in his hands. The girl asked to accept her condolences, and Ein thanked her. The partners turned around and headed towards the exit. The protagonist asked his companion what the girl was talking about. Ein sadly said that all the members of his squad were dead. The guy himself, in turn, was the leader of this group. He was supposed to be responsible for their lives. But in the end, this situation happened. The adventurer looked into the boy's eyes and asked him what he thought an opinion would be formed about such a leader. At the same moment, Ark guessed what Ein meant. The 2 partners walked out of the guild building depressed. Suddenly, they saw a crowd in front of them. The green-haired adventurer said that the rumors had spread much faster than he had expected them to. Looking at the people in front of him, he said he didn't want Ark to be hurt by it. At the same second, the relatives of the victims hurled threats and insults at Ein. At this point, his partner told Ark that he now had to talk to the friends and families of his fallen comrades himself. Now it is up to him as a leader to take on the full wrath of these people. He was appointed squad leader. All his subordinates were killed by his mistake. So now, as sad as it doesn't change the fact that he is guilty. The desperate people did not stop shouting insults at Ein. They blamed him for the deaths of their acquaintances and friends. Suddenly, the guy opened his mouth and the whole crowd went silent. He said he takes full responsibility for what happened. Ain continued, saying that he had not been able to keep any member of the group from being killed. As a result, all the adventurers died solely because of his mistakes. The crowd was silent for a while. For a second, it seemed that they accepted Ain's contrition. Suddenly, one man shouted out that he didn't care who or how much regret he had for what he had done. Then he trembled and cried. Through his sobs, the boy said that all these guys were the best adventurers. Just then, he shouted out that he didn't believe that the squad could lose to a level 150 flame dragon. Ark was surprised when he heard this. He realized that all these people were wrong, and they didn't know what was real. The squad encountered a level 300 level world destroyer. None of the adventurers were prepared to face such a terrifying force. Ark tried to cut into the conversation and say that it wasn't as the relatives had been told. But Ain stopped his partner abruptly. The protagonist was surprised to ask his companion why he was doing this. The adventurer said that he really appreciated that the boy was concerned about him. But regardless of the degree of danger, it is Ain who is to blame for the squad's demise. The guy said that if he had ordered the evacuation of the villagers then, he could have avoided what happened. Suddenly, someone shouted loudly from the crowd, saying that they had no intention of listening to these pathetic excuses. A tall bald man was making his way toward the companions, shoving people. He suddenly shouted out that Ain had condemned his comrades to death for a greater reward. The impudent, unknown man instantly enraged Ark. He reminded him a lot of one of Ain's deputies on that trip. The protagonist ran up to the bald Vernier and said that Ain would never do such a thing in his life. The adventurer tried to quiet his friend, but Ark was unstoppable. The thug suddenly ordered the brat to shut his mouth, saying that he didn't want to hear excuses from some strangers. The protagonist instantly became enraged, saying that he wasn't an outsider, and he and Ain fought a level 300 level world destroyer together. At that very second, the entire crowd whispered sharply. People didn't believe that anyone could come back alive after such a battle. One of the relatives of the dead said that someone should go to the guild and find out the details. The bald big guy opened the information panel and waved his hand, saying that the brat shouldn't be talking such nonsense. Ark recognized the bulky man's name as Will. The big man was surprised that the guy had the same level as him. Still, the main question remained how he survived against a level 300 level monster. The guy, realizing where this was going, replied that he had his reasons. Will cocked his head up and laughed out loud. He said, almost crying, that he'd never heard such nonsense. Suddenly, the big man looked menacingly at Ark and ordered the milkman to get the hell out of here. The protagonist didn't budge and, after calling his opponent a fatty, said he should make him. In the next second, both adventurers drew their swords and crossed them, glaring at each other hatefully. From the power of the fighters, shockwaves began to split the air around them. Shielding himself from the flying sand, Ain ordered Ark to stop doing things like that. However, the fight suddenly turned into an active phase. Ain tried to reason with his partner, saying that he was the one who was a bad leader, and it was because of his mistake that his comrades died. But neither Ark nor Will heard the calls to stop. After several repeated attacks, both fighters landed on the ground and the bout was broken for a while. Suddenly, Ark shouted that what Ain was saying was not true. The green-haired adventurer looked at his partner in bewilderment and asked what he meant. The protagonist rose to his feet. He said that there was no denying the fact that all the comrades had died. In the next second, Ark and Will crossed swords again. This time it seemed that the protagonist had some advantage. In the heat of battle, the boy shouted that there was no way anyone could have predicted such an outcome. Ark addressed the gathered men, saying that as squad leader, Ain had been with his comrades to the very end, even in the face of death. The guy then gave a strong blow to Will's sword, while saying that Ain didn't abandon his comrades and run away from the battlefield. The bulky man's weapon flew back a few meters and embedded itself into the ground with a clang. Will stepped back to a safe distance and mumbled something to himself, his whole body shaking. Ark then turned to his partner and said that there was another factor that proved Ain's innocence. While the guy was in floods of tears, the protagonist said that someone who faked death for a reward would never mourn his friends. After a brief silence, the boy said that if Ain wanted to take responsibility for the deaths of his comrades, he would have no objection. But the same Ark added that it is wrong to take responsibility for everything that has happened, because many things happen regardless of the person. Holding back tears, the protagonist told Ain that he was a leader who, despite the situation, did not abandon his comrades and avenged their deaths. The green-haired adventurer looked up with tearful eyes and asked the guy why he was helping him. Suddenly, Ark held out his hand to his partner and said that he was the ideal adventurer that the protagonist aspires to be. After that, the guy helped Ewan up off the ground. Suddenly angry, Will muttered that this wasn't over. He reached behind his back and grabbed the small knife attached to his belt. Shouting that he hated living strangers, the bulky man swooped down on Ark from behind his back. Ain noticed the approaching danger and warned his partner to be more careful. Ark turned around. However, he realized he didn't have much time to react. But suddenly the path of the running Will was blocked by an unknown man who seemed to appear out of nowhere. The blade of his sword was at the level of the bulky man's neck. The old man in white and gold robes looked menacingly at Ain and said that he had been waiting for him to return. Ark unsheathed his sword and looked at the strange man across from him. In turn, the green-haired adventurer nodded his head and said he understood that. The protagonist sensed that this was no ordinary old man. There was a terrifying aura emanating from him. In addition, the guy couldn't guess who it was at all. Suddenly, Ain calmly asked his companion to lower his sword, causing Ark to look at him incomprehensibly. The guy explained that the person opposite is his colleague. He was the supreme adventurer of the Sword of Salvation Guild. His name was Mr. Guirai. This venerable man possessed an incredible 200th level. The old man turned to the protagonist, asking if he was an adventurer named Ark. After receiving an affirmative nod, the old man thanked the boy for saving Ain during the battle against the Destroyer of Worlds. He also admired the fact that both guys had taken part in defeating that monster. The relatives of the dead also heard the conversation. They couldn't believe that two brats could defeat such a powerful creature. But if such things were confirmed by the supreme adventurer of the guild himself, then those words were surely true. Unexpectedly, Guirai added that he was also aware of their meeting with that bastard named Baldar. Ark was surprised that some old man already knew about such confidential things. Ain assured him, however, that everything that had happened in the village had to be told. The adventurer said that he immediately informed the central office and the guildmaster about Baldar. Ain decided to make the point clear to his colleague. The Destroyer of Worlds had not been killed in his time. It was only thanks to Ark that he had been defeated. All this would not have happened if Baldar had destroyed the core, which he was well aware of. So now that the central office had learned of what one of the best adventurers was up to, there was a bounty on him. Guirai said that now he understood everything. The old man explained that he had been on an expedition and could not come to the aid of Ain's group. Besides, he had only recently arrived in Durham, just after he had been informed of what had happened. Suddenly, Mr. Guirai looked at the relatives of the dead. He said through gritted teeth that as soon as he returned, a bunch of idiots started blaming the squad leader for the deaths of his comrades. Looking at Will menacingly, the old man added that none of them even wanted to get into the situation. Jerry then turned to the families of the victims. He said he understood their pain and no words or money would bring their loved ones back to life. But suddenly, the old man shouted that that's what adventurers are for. It is their job to keep the peace and quiet of the country's citizens, and each time they risk their lives for the good of others. Giri said angrily that all of the dead knew what they were getting into when they became adventurers, and that was their fate. The old man looked around at those present in fury, saying that they were in the business of passing the buck to those who had fought their loved ones to the very end. After these strong words, the crowd fell silent. At the end, the old man said that was the end of any talk they would have about this hike. Ark was also greatly impressed by Girai's speech. He asked his partner if this man was a good man. He replied that the protagonist may not doubt him, but this type is very harsh. After the relatives of the dead had dispersed, the old man turned around and looked menacingly at Ain. Guirai then told the green-haired adventurer in no uncertain terms that he was expelling the one from the guild. Ark looked at the old man in bewilderment and asked what he meant. However, from the look on Ain's face, he had expected a similar outcome. Guirai said that he had resolved the misunderstanding anyway, but the guy's incompetence could not be explained in any way. In the next second, he called Ain the leader who had doomed the entire team to death. Mr. Guirai explained that he could not leave a man with such a past in one of Durham's strongest guilds. Ark was very much surprised to learn that this Sword of Salvation organization was so top-notch. The old man ended his explanation by saying that he was sorry and asked Ain if he had any objections to the decision. The guy replied that he understood, but he had one last favor to ask. Guirai folded his arms across his chest and asked, exhaling heavily to see what it was all about. Ain clapped his partner on the back and asked if the Ark Guild would accept Ark as a member. The protagonist huffed at his partner upon hearing such an unexpected request. However, Ain didn't seem to be listening to the boy. He said that if the boy could find allies in the guild, Ark would be able to achieve a lot in the future, bringing benefit to the city. The green-haired man smiled, saying that even though he had been expelled from the guild, his friend now had every prospect of becoming a first-class adventurer. Mr. Girai was silent for a few seconds, and then tried to say that he understood everything. However, he was immediately interrupted by the protagonist, shouting that he didn't agree to it. Ein looked at his partner in bewilderment, who wasn't about to accept such a great offer. The boy muttered that he understood the reason for expelling Ein. He also realized that he had no way to influence it. But suddenly, Ark shouted sharply, saying that he would not join an organization that threw things at his comrades for the sake of his own reputation. The protagonist was furious, and Ein tried to calm him down. The adventurer said that if his partner joined the guild, he could get the support of various influential people. Furthermore, Ein added that Ark had told him himself that he wanted to join the guild very badly to help people. Therefore, a chance like this where he could be vouched for should not be missed. Suddenly, the boy ironically asked his companion, "Do you really have to join somewhere to save people?" Without receiving a reply, he looked at the headquarters building and said that in that case, he would just form his own guild. After this unexpectedly daring demarche, the paths of Jarius and the boys parted. The boys went to one of the city streets. Walking down an alleyway, Aang led his partner to an old abandoned tower. The protagonist stared in bewilderment at the dilapidated building that seemed about to collapse. Ark turned to the adventurer, asking if this was really the right place for them. Ein replied without a shadow of a doubt that it wasn't so bad here. He looked around the building again and told the protagonist that this was where the history of his guild would begin. Now this place was to be their main base. The boy then lit up with happiness and thanked the guy for inviting him into his guild. Ark smiled and replied that he couldn't have done otherwise. Immediately after Ein's expulsion, Ark announced the formation of his own guild, in which his new partner would be the first member. Against Mr. Gairi's background, proclaiming one's own organization seemed childish. After the building was inspected from the outside, Ark added that he still had a lot to learn from Ein to become as top-notch an adventurer. He added that he was willing to receive any advice on the matter. The partner replied to his new leader that he would try to help him with useful things. After that, the guys gave each other fist bumps and headed inside the base. Walking through the door, the protagonist thought that there would be few pluses from this place so far. Inside, everything looked very shabby. The first thing to do was to rebuild the place from scratch. Inspecting the broken walls, Ein reminded them that they weren't officially a guild yet, and they didn't have much money. The guy said that a huge amount of what was available had to be given just to buy this building. Although they received an incredible reward for killing the Destroyer of Worlds, most of that money was given to the families of those who died on this expedition. In the corner of the room, Ark unexpectedly found an old closet. He opened the doors to see what was inside. The boy thought to himself that he'd originally expected their money to be enough for everything, but he'd miscalculated. Suddenly, a cloud of dust erupted from an old closet, enveloping the protagonist from head to toe. Ark began to frantically shake off the dirt, while Ein laughed at what had happened. They had spent the last of their money on this building to open their guild headquarters. But as expected, the conditions here were completely inhumane. So the first thing to do was to get the building looking tidy and do a general cleaning. In the process, expectedly, there were many embarrassments. Now that the boys were within the confines of a safe city, they could take their time getting nowhere. They both had no responsibilities left to anyone. Ark thought with a smile that when he got that armor, his whole life had turned into a battlefield. He missed those peaceful days so much. While the heroes were cleaning the inside of the building, they didn't see anyone approaching them from outside. Suddenly, the door swung open sharply and a woman's voice apologized for the intrusion. The boys looked toward the passageway in bewilderment to see who had broken in. Suddenly, Ark saw Mill and Lyra standing in the doorway. The boy immediately had a lot of questions about how they had gotten here alone. Suddenly, Mill shouted furiously that he wouldn't get rid of them that easily. In turn, Lyra said in a sad voice that she was upset that the main character had left the village without even saying goodbye to them. Both girls immediately pounced on Ark, who didn't understand why he deserved such attention. At the same moment, it was still the middle of the day in the city. A man in armor ran outside Durham, shouting an urgent errand. Toward the gates of the city, he announced that all urgent adventurers needed to head to the west entrance immediately. The man rushed past the guards, leaving the warriors puzzled. One of the adventurers, shield in hand, said he would go forward. His partner said he should not be so reckless. The guard was about to run forward, but he immediately stopped and looked at the scene in front of him with a frightened look. The thing held a knight in armor with its huge teeth. Numerous hordes of skeletons crowded next to the creature. This monster was colossal in size. It looked like some unknown beetle. The monster furiously devoured everyone present with its gaze. The adventurers who came running at the call of help were hesitant to go on the attack against the unknown creature. Suddenly, the soldier, who was being held tightly in his teeth by a beetle, began to give signs of life. After a while, he cried out violently, asking his companions to save him. Hearing this, that monster tightened its grip, crushing the hapless adventurer. The fortress guards who saw this were shocked at the strength of this gigantic creature. After the monster swallowed the body of the adventurer it had killed, its gaze once again fell on the fortress guards. In the next instant, the giant let out a scream that could be heard throughout the city. Meanwhile, back at the base, Mill and Lyra were trying to get a response from Ark. They asked why a guy would just pick up and leave the village like that. The girls said they wouldn't leave here without an explanation. The protagonist made an awkward smile and tried to answer something. Immediately, however, he was attracted to a noise in the street that was not like the usual hum of city neighborhoods. Suddenly, an unknown voice from outside shouted that a huge crowd of monsters had appeared at the west gate. A man's voice shouted exasperatedly for all free adventurers to head west. Hearing the information, Ark turned around and told Ein that they were moving out immediately. The boy nodded his head and turned to the guests, telling them that they would have to leave by the west gate. Ark looked at the girls with a serious look and turned to them. The boy explained that he would now have to leave for a while, and he would later tell the reason why he had decided to leave the village. Looking at the distraught Mill and Lyra, the protagonist added that they could wait for them here. The boy then turned toward the exit and beckoned Ein to follow him. Now they had to prove themselves worthy on their first mission as Durham's new guild. Meanwhile, the guards looked at the creature in horror and didn't know what to do with it. The most baffling thing was how such a huge monster could appear right outside the gates of the city unnoticed. Those who took advantage of the information panel saw a frightening sight. This monster, called Desolate Cursed, had an incredible 210th level. Will was also fighting the skeletons in the front rows. The level 20 nomads were not a serious problem for him. Having roughly determined the nature of the actions of these monsters, the adventurer began to cut them down one by one with ease. However, even a serious level advantage wasn't that big of an argument, considering that there were a whole horde of skeletons. Will looked at the approaching monsters and ironically thought that some weaklings were trying to take him on in numbers. With that thought, the bulky man rushed into a new attack, and indeed all the skeletons shattered into small bones with the first blow. Will looked around the battlefield and asked one of the guards where Guiri was. The knight replied that he had already sent a messenger for him. The big guy cursed and said that if things continued like this, they would have to attack alone. No sooner had Will finished speaking than he realized that the monster was right up close to him. Turning around, the adventurer laughed nervously at the sight of approaching danger. However, then it was as if the space around the monster began to change. He felt that something unusual was approaching. A second later, the monster released several dozen blue orbs towards the defenders of the fortress. These strange objects turned into strips that began to wrap around the adventurers one by one. The defenders began to fall to the ground, screaming as their bodies felt numb. All those unlucky enough to be hit by the spell said they couldn't even move. The exhausted Will also fell to his knee. He realized that this attack had done absolutely no physical harm. Suddenly, he remembered the name of a similar spell. A desert curse could immobilize a person. This ability slowly kills the victim's body, starting with a simple numbness. However, in the case of the guards, it was not the spell itself that was most dangerous. With no ability to move in any way, even the most innocuous skeleton could prove fatal to them. One such monster was already swinging his sword to finish Will off. The big man couldn't move a muscle, and any resistance was impossible. But suddenly the bulky man was saved from death by Ark, who had suddenly appeared on the battlefield. The guy killed the skeleton with ease and flew past the captured guards and found himself right in front of the monster's face. After looking around at the monsters in front of him, the protagonist called out to Ein. The green-haired adventurer, meanwhile, was tearing through the hordes of skeletons with ease. He asked his partner, "What happened?" The boy said it seemed like it was time to raise his own level. Ein confirmed Ark's speculation, saying that this time, given the circumstances, the guy might not hold back. After that, the protagonist pounced on the numerous skeleton squads with lightning speed. The monsters, before they even had time to realize what had happened, one by one shattered into tiny shards, literally reached level 250 within a few minutes. After that, Ein said that he was taking the remaining creatures over. He looked back through the flying bones at his partner and said he had his back to him. That was when Ark concentrated his aura and said he was starting the main course. Seeing that some human had slaughtered almost his entire horde, the monster screamed exhaustedly. After once again surveying the battlefield, the guy guessed that this monster had the ability to cast curses on adventurers. Examining the guards who appeared to be shackled by the cursed one's spells, the boy smiled and thought that it wouldn't happen to him. He then soared into the air, and once he was right above the monster's head, he said that this time the monster would have to endure all the curses he had prepared for it. Confident of his victory, the boy grinned and ironically asked his opponent if he could handle his sword. Meanwhile, while the main battle was taking place near the western gate, Mr. Guirai headed towards the eastern gate. Many expected him to help deal with the desert curse that was making its way from the other side. However, the old man had other plans. Looking straight ahead, he remembered the messenger's report that the western gate was being attacked by hordes of monsters. However, Guirai trusted his intuition and decided to check the east gate as well this time since it was quite noisy. However, he never imagined he would encounter an identical problem in this part of town. Another monster army, similar in description to the one that attacked from the west, now came from the east as well. Seeing the man in front of him, the desolate cursed roared exhaustedly. This time, the levels of the opponents were about the same, so the chances of winning were relatively equal. Upon seeing Guirai, the skeletons immediately pounced on him from all sides. In turn, Desolate Cursed began preparing the same attack to immobilize the man. Guirai looked at the advancing monsters with a serious look. The old man had said that even if they fought against him alone, they could not expect to win easily. Nevertheless, he recognized that his opponent was definitely worthy of admiration. After that, Guirai spoke directly to the Cursed One and said that no matter what army he gathered, it wouldn't be enough to win. With a swing of his sword, the Supreme Adventurer used the legendary skill Demonic Adventuring. Seeing that the opponent was about to launch an attack, Desolate Cursed directed several spherical spells towards the man. At the same moment, Guirai pointed his blade at the monster and said that its life would be cut short in exactly 5 seconds. At the same time, Ark attacked the monster near the west gate. With a shout, he tried to split the monster's skull, but the monster managed to block the blow with one of his hands. After the first failed attempt, the guy moved some distance away. The protagonist then pounced on his foe once more, slicing off limb after limb. During one of the maneuvers, a group of skeletons tried to attack the boy in the back. Ark noticed this, however, and repelled the attack almost effortlessly. For a while, he had to switch back to killing skeletons. In the heat of battle, one of the smaller monsters once again attempted to plunge its blade into the back of the protagonist. However, their speed was now so incomparable that the boy simply grabbed the blade of the sword that the skeleton had used to try to cut his neck. He turned around and looked fiercely at the weak creature. Ark said that if this was all they could do, they didn't stand a chance. He then sliced the monster's neck without a second thought. The protagonist's level has increased a few more points due to new kills. Now he already possessed an incredible 290 levels. After that, the skeletons did not dare to attack him again. But Desolation Cursed was still reeling from the loss of his limbs. He came at Ark from behind again. The span of his paws was much larger than the boy had calculated. Now he had to dodge the enemy's attacks time after time. After buying some time, the Desolate Cursed prepared his spell for action. He shot several spheres towards Ark. The boy had seen how this spell had bound those knights, but he didn't know exactly how this ability worked. Seeing this situation, Ein shouted to his partner that there was no way you could show your face before these spheres. Meanwhile, the protagonist thrust his sword into the ground and said that there was no need to worry about him. At the same instant, a tremendous explosion shook the battlefield. Ark said with a smile that there was no way he was going to let those balls hit him. Meanwhile, Will came to his senses and saw someone fighting the monster. Suddenly, he saw in this hero the very same scoundrel with whom he had fought in the square. However, this guy has now defeated such a complex creature with incredible ease. After many slashing wounds, the Cursed One slumped to the ground. Making sure the monster didn't move, Ark moved closer to its head. The boy angrily asked the monster if he was satisfied with cursing many innocent people. After a short pause, he added that it wasn't that important, and regardless of his answer, the outcome would be the same. Swinging his sword, the guy calmly said that the Cursed One would die now, but suddenly the monster hissed sharply. Ark appeared shocked at this reincarnation, convinced that the thing would not rise again. After that, blue spheres began to emerge from the monster's body one after another. The boy looked at this strange sight in bewilderment and tried to understand if the Cursed One was still not dead. As if answering that question, the creature let out a few odd chuckles. After those strange sounds, all the spheres suddenly rushed towards Durham. The hero turned around and saw that a terrible thing was happening. Then he pulled out his blade and realized that once again he had let his guard down. With one swift blow, Arc blew the monster's head off. However, even after the opponent was surely dead, the spheres were not lost. The spells were already outside the walls and rushing towards the people in the street.
Pet the cat.